Chapter 522. Federer, Federer! How helpless! Big tears. There is truly no perfect thing in the world. How can there be a godlike existence? Today is the last day of the festival. I sincerely ask everyone for a few more monthly tickets. Fan Xian's heart jumped. He lowered his head slightly and said a moment later, I do. Do you believe there are gods in the world? The emperor gazed at him calmly. Fan Xian replied straightforwardly, I do. He didn't know why the emperor was asking this question. For Fan Xian to be able to reincarnate into the land of the Qing kingdom, he, without question, deeply believed in such things as miracles. The Fan Xian of this life was not the Fan Xin of his previous life. He was a true idealist. Come with me. Fan Xian's head was filled with confusion as he followed the mysterious emperor toward the temple hidden among the trees at the top of the mountain. The name of Dong Mountain was widely known throughout the world. At first, it was known for its jade. Later, it became known for its miracles. Countless commoners who had no money for treatment had come here to worship the gods. Their illnesses had taken a great turn for the better. It was also revered as a holy land by the ascetic monks of the world. In the past, Fan Xian had always thought that the Qing temple was deliberately mystifying things. Foolish women and foolish people mistook psychological consolation for true healing. Now the emperor's expression appeared very cautious. Could the Qing temple at the top of the mountain truly hear the will of heaven and be able to make contact with the illusory temple of legend? Harboring countless questions and slight excitement, Fan Xian followed the emperor around a quiet and secluded stone path and came to a particularly old temple behind the temple. The mountain wind was strong. It blew the bells under the eaves of the temple, making a clear and calming sound. It looked like the priests at the foot of the mountain had not lied. It was clear that the temples at the top of the mountain had not been repaired for many years. However, the mountain wind that had been blowing for thousands of years did not blow the old little temple into ruins. Looking at the style of the little temple's architecture and the dark and somber colors, Fan Xian's heart jumped. Involuntarily, he felt a sense of reverence, just like when he had first entered the Qing temple in Jingdou. At that time, the emperor had been inside the Qing temple, and he had been outside. Now, he had followed the emperor to a place that seemed to be out of this world. A strange feeling rose in Fan Xian's heart. The emperor seemed to be very familiar with this path, or perhaps everything about Dong Mountain. Standing outside the little temple, the emperor calmly said, Don't be curious and don't get tired of listening. The reason is actually very simple. After meeting your mother in Danzhou, we did not miss out on the scenery of Dong Mountain. We once stayed here for a time. Although he didn't know how the emperor had guessed his thoughts, suddenly hearing these words, Fan Xian's mood immediately changed. Looking at the old buildings around him, his gaze carried a sense of familiarity and yearning. However, the emperor's following words immediately shattered Fan Xian's relaxed and joyful mood. The Lord of 10,000 creations does not enter unfathomable places. The emperor laughed coldly and repeated the words Fan Xian had used to admonish him in Danzhou yesterday. I know what you have been worried about these 2 days. Let me ask you, if you were in Jingdou right now and you were that woman, what would you do? Fan Xian did not feign fear. Instead, he sank straight into thought. He had thought about this question countless times. In the end, he realized that if internal strife occurred in Qing Kingdom and there were problems in Jingdou, the eldest princess, who was currently imprisoned in a side courtyard, only had one path to take. Perhaps she would do many things, but the center of everything, the foundation of everything, was just as the emperor had said yesterday. There was only one way to kill the emperor. First, I had to leave the Overwatch Council's surveillance and make contact with my own power, Fan Xian said without confidence. Fan Xian said with some uncertainty, but this matter must have started a few months ago. I don't think the eldest princess has this ability. The emperor coldly said, Do you believe that 2 people could set a palace on fire? And in the early hours of a thunderstorm? Fan Xian shook his head, not daring to show too much emotion. Through his own channels, he had learned the inside story of the change in the royal palace a few months ago. He knew that the Eastern Palace had caught fire at that time. It was the Crown Prince who had done this to save himself and alert the Empress Dowager. At the time, he had only been concerned with admiring the Crown Prince and his brother's actions. Hearing the Emperor's words, only now did he realize that there was something fishy about this matter. "I killed so many people, but she didn't resist at all," the Emperor said. Yet, she still had extra thoughts in the Eastern Palace to help the Crown Prince. "My sister's actions are always so incomprehensible. If she was able to avoid the Overwatch Council's surveillance and make contact with her people, I would not find it strange at all." From this conversation, it could be heard that the Emperor had experienced the betrayal of his sister and son. Wrong. It should be said that after he had self-righteously forced his sister and son to betray him, or after the betrayal that had yet to come, his entire personality had changed slightly. He had already regarded Fan Xian, the illegitimate child who had not been by his side since childhood and had appeared particularly loyal and filial after entering the capital, as the most trustworthy person. However, this kind of trust made Fan Xian feel the pressure increase. He rubbed his slightly dry throat and glanced at the Emperor. If the eldest princess had already made contact with her people a few months ago, then she only needed to wait for an opportunity. "I think that now that you are far from Jingdo, it is the best opportunity. You only need to tell me what she will do. You don't need to constantly remind me of this. Yes, I think that the eldest princess will use all of the power she has built over the past 20 years to strike like lightning at Dong Mountain or on the way back to the capital. Regardless of success or failure, she will seal off news of the Emperor and falsely announce to the world that the Emperor has met with misfortune and will be succeeded by the Crown Prince or the Second Prince. There's no need to say nonsense like success or failure. Since she is going to do it, she wants me dead." Fan Xian's analysis was very shallow and direct. If the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, could truly escape unscathed, she would certainly make this choice. The so-called plot, in the end, was still a matter of life and death, a matter of victory and defeat. As long as life and death had been decided, victory and defeat had been decided, she had the support of the princes in Jingdo and the Yi and Qin families. If she then threw the matter of the Emperor being assassinated onto Fan Xian, who could sit on that throne? Unless Chun Pingping led the pitiful 500 Black Knights and rebelled again. He lowered his head and said, "Since the Emperor has come, naturally, he has a well-thought-out plan." The Emperor glanced at him and faintly said, "What power can Yunrui have? The Juanshang Conference? Now that I think about it, I should have listened to Director Chun and you last year and wiped out that stupid conference." The Juanshang Conference is only an evacuation organization. Fan Xian repeated his father-in-law's reasoning. The key is what kind of power the eldest princess can mobilize. The Great Dong Mountain is by the sea and deep within the borders of the country. It is impossible to use an army to attack. The Emperor smiled coldly and said. The Emperor sneered and said, "The 10,000-mile stairway to heaven. If someone dares to assassinate me, they must first have the ability to ascend to heaven." Fan Xian lowered his head slightly. He understood what the Emperor meant. The Great Dong Mountain's position was very clever. It would be difficult to mobilize an army to attack. To the north, Danzhou's chain of tall mountains and cliffs blocked the last bit of danger for an army. Since there was no need to consider this, to assassinate the ruler of a country, especially the ruler of the most powerful country in the world, one could only use assassins. Normal people were completely meaningless. They couldn't even break through the outermost defensive ring of the Imperial Army, much less the hundreds of terrifying Tiger Guard aces on the summit of the mountain. Those who came did not have good intentions, and those with good intentions did not come. If the eldest princess truly wanted to assassinate the emperor, one could imagine the skill of the assassins. Yi Luyun is a guest of the Juanshang conference, Fan Xian said quietly. Fan Xian said silently, the eldest princess does not have many aces herself. After experiencing the attack in the valley, I feel that some people in court are becoming more and more impudent. No matter what an impudent person does, it is not surprising. He was talking about the military elders in the Qin kingdom. If these people collectively stood against the emperor, what kind of situation would it be? The emperor did not continue Fan Xian's words. He only quietly said, my personal visit to Dong Mountain this time has not only confused you, but the two scholars also strongly opposed it. Yet, I still have to come. First, it is because I have stayed in the palace for too long. I want to come out and see the places I passed through in the past. Second, Cheng Qian hurt my heart. If I want to depose him, I will do so openly and not give anyone any chance to say anything. Fan Xian thought about it. The emperor beside him could probably be considered the most diligent and strangest emperor in history. After ascending to the throne, particularly after the end of the major battle, the emperor had never left Jingdou again. He did not go on the routine nationwide tours of a prosperous ruler. The emperor rarely even came out of the royal palace. Fan Xian only knew of the one time he had seen him outside Taiping courtyard. The emperor suddenly paused and smiled slightly. The third reason is very simple. I purposely wanted to give Yunrui a chance to see if that Juanshang conference could actually remove me as a monarch. Fan Xian shook his head and said, it is still the same words I said before. Why take the risk? Why come here? Your Majesty is the master of the world. With one edict, the remnants of the Juanshang conference will immediately fall to pieces. They are not worth mentioning at all. Is that so? But what about Yi Luyun? The emperor smiled slightly. His brows gradually relaxed. Fan Xian was speechless. Only now did he finally understand just how confident the emperor was. He was using himself as bait. What he was plotting was none other than Yi Luyun, the guest of the Juanshang conference. The great grandmaster of the Qin kingdom, Yi Luyun. This carefree warrior who floated overseas was in the wilderness while the emperor was in court. The two of them mutually checked and balanced each other. Only then did they create a loyal yet distant relationship between the Yi family and the royal family. If the emperor was able to kill Yi Luyun with his sword, then there would not be a sliver of power within the Qin kingdom that could shake the foundation of his rule. In other words, Yi Luyun had always been a malignant tumor in the emperor's heart. He had come to Dong Mountain to use the wonders of Dong Mountain to remove the tumor. Fan Xian still felt it was absurd. Even if you had over 100 tiger guards and eunuch Hong, that mysterious old creature, if the eldest princess moved, she would certainly have countless powers to cooperate with Yi Luyun. Even if Yi Luyun failed to assassinate the emperor, given the great grandmaster's otherworldly realm, how could you keep him? He had once personally experienced Yi Luyun toppling a building with half a sword in Hangzhou, so he knew the terrifying extent of Yi Luyun's power. Unless the Qing Iron Riders formed camps and endless volleys of arrows were used, perhaps it was possible to kill Yi Luyun on the plains. However, the emperor was on the lonely peak. Yi Luyun floated here and then away. He would not give the tiger guards the chance to surround him. As for the imperial soldiers at the foot of the mountain, due to the terrain, they were unable to form a cavalry charge formation. How can one kill a great grandmaster? This was something Fan Xian had thought about for an entire year. He had come up with many conclusions. Among them, the safest was to stand 500 meters away and use the assault rifle he had hidden like a precious son to snipe him. However, this kind of situation was not easy to create. The great grandmasters were elusive. Their senses were too powerful. It was impossible for them to stand there and give him too much time to aim. How could one kill a great grandmaster? In the end, Fan Xian thought of the most reliable method. It was to use 2 great grandmasters to kill a great grandmaster. This was a very senseless and wasteful way of thinking. 2 children would definitely be able to defeat 1 child. Of course, 2 stones were heavier than 1 stone. The problem was that great grandmasters were not products that could be mass-produced. They were rare geniuses. Who could find 2 great grandmasters? Thus, I had to come to Dong Mountain because I needed a person. This person will never leave Dong Mountain to suit my thoughts. The Emperor looked at Fan Xian with a slight smile. He then pushed open the wooden door of the old temple. The wooden door creaked. Fan Xian's gaze drifted over. His heart tightened abruptly. Countless surprises and the irrepressible joy of a long separation flashed through his eyes. Yan Bingyun sat in a daze in a room in the Overwatch Council. He did not sit in that secret room because the director had returned to Jingdo in a wheelchair and returned to his own room. The power that Yan Bingyun had temporarily obtained had also been returned. He was the head of the 4th Bureau. His room was facing the street. The window was not covered with black cloth. The sunlight from outside seeped in and lit up the room. Standing at the window, he could clearly see the golden eaves of the royal palace. There was no master in the royal palace. The emperor's entourage should have already reached Dongshan Road, right? Yan Bingyun thought that ever since the emperor had left the capital, the people of Jingdo had all become well-behaved and didn't give the Overwatch Council too many problems. At this moment, everyone was afraid that the emperor, who was far away from Jingdo, would suspect something. Everyone knew the emperor's main purpose in offering sacrifices to heaven. He could not have the crown prince stay in the palace to supervise the country. Thus, the Empress Dowager once again closed the curtains. The imperial army that the great prince controlled became careful. The Jingdo garrison also increased patrols. Chapter 523. After getting a rough idea of the time, Yan Bingyun closed the window and sat back in his chair. He took out a beautifully embroidered pouch from his clothes and took out a few melon seeds from inside. He brought them to his lips and carefully chewed them. He appeared very bored. Only when his gaze landed on the pouch did he become warm and affectionate. This pouch had been embroidered by Lady Shen. Sir Yen Jr. had been particularly idle these past few days. He no longer needed to oversee council affairs, nor did he need to monitor court officials with the sensitivity of the 1st Bureau staff. Other than the daily affairs of the 4th Bureau, he did not have much to do. In the wilderness between Yanjing and Sangzhou, after Shang Shanhu had suffered a great loss at Yan Xiaoyi's hands, he had calmed down. Although the northern Qi people had submitted a letter of reprimand, the accidental injury investigation was still ongoing. There were no unusual movements in Shangjing, and Dongyi was also very quiet. These were the things the 4th Bureau had to manage. Before the emperor left the capital, the 4th Bureau had already released enough fake news to ensure the silence of both sides. Yan Bingyun believed that given the Overwatch Council's power, even if the northern Qi royal family and Sigujian knew of the emperor's tour, they would not be able to react in a short amount of time. Furthermore, he had no choice but to be relaxed. Even without these errands, the Jingdo center of the Qinian unit was still under Yan Bingyun's control. Logically speaking, for something as important as the emperor's tour, he should have notified Fan Xian ahead of time. However, what he did not understand was that once Director Chen returned to the capital, he suppressed this idea and firmly suppressed it. This was the question that had puzzled Fan Xian in Danzhou. Yan Bingyun still did not know that Commissioner Fan had already met up with the royal entourage. He was still faintly at a loss. At the same time, he was nervous. Jingdo appeared calm. With the imperial army, the Jingdo garrison, and Director Chen emanating a dark and terrifying aura, nothing major could happen. If something major was going to happen, it should be at the emperor's side, far away from Jingdo. Yan Bingyun smiled bitterly as he stood at the window and looked at Tianhe Avenue below and the royal palace not far away. His position was not high, but his role was complicated. He was the third most important person in the Overwatch Council and Fan Xian's trusted aide. However, his father had another identity. Most importantly, he was one of the young people the Emperor had personally summoned into the palace. After a long night of conversation, he had another identity. No wonder Headmaster Chern suppressed him the moment he returned to the capital. Presumably, the headmaster also had some opinions about him. As for why Director Chen did not allow him to inform Fan Xian, Yan Bingyun, relying on his unique information from 3 places, vaguely guessed a sliver of the truth. He began to fear this truth. Even if Director Chen died by the Emperor's side, would something big happen? That was why he wanted to go with the flow and get Fan Xian as far away from the royal entourage as possible. However, the director was so loyal to the Emperor. No matter how much he loved Fan Xian, how could he place Fan Xian's safety above the Emperor's life and death? Ding dong, the copper bell rang. The most special homecoming signal in the Jingdo Yamens rang out. Countless hurried officials walked out of the Overwatch Council's square building. They were not busy spreading evil water. They were in a hurry to go home. Special agents were also public servants, and the people in the Overwatch Council were all civil servants. They were no different from ordinary people. Yan Bingyun didn't have much to pack. He walked straight out of the building and sat in his family's carriage. Hurrying back to the Viscount's manor, he didn't go to chat with Sister Shen. Instead, he went directly to his father's study and asked, "Is there any news from the Qin family?" Yen Ruohai glanced at his son and shook his head. "You're in charge of the 4th Bureau in the council. Is there any movement from Shao Mountain?" Shao Mountain's location was special. It happened to be at the entrance of Dongshan Road. This place was in the northeast of the Qin Kingdom and not far from Dani. Because no one dared to pass through the dense primordial forest between Danzhou and Dani, the transportation between the 2 places mainly relied on the sea or circled around Shao Mountain. Originally, there was not much power on Dongshan Road that could threaten the royal entourage. However, Shao Mountain just happened to be on the road from Dongshan Road back to the capital. The most important problem was that the Yen father and son both knew that the old Qin master's secret trusted soldiers had been trained in that mountain. The group that had attacked Fan Xian outside Jingdo at the end of the year had been moved over from Shao Mountain by the Qin family without the court's knowledge. Shao Mountain has been quiet. Ever since that incident, the council has been keeping a close eye on it with great attention. If there is any strange movement, it cannot be hidden from us. Yan Bingyun relaxed slightly and sat down. Yen Ruohai smiled slightly and said, "What we know is what the director knows and what the emperor knows. Since the emperor dares to take 2,000 imperial soldiers to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, it is either because he doesn't think much of the people in Shao Mountain or because he believes in the old Qin master's loyalty." Loyalty? Yan Bingyun sighed. Secretly assassinating important officials of the imperial court is considered loyalty? There are many levels of loyalty. Perhaps the emperor has already doubted the old master's loyalty after what happened last time. In reality, there is always a difference between an official and the emperor himself. Yen Ruohai paused and then asked seriously, "I have already retired and shouldn't ask, but I am still curious. Are there any problems in Dingzhou?" Yan Bingyun shook his head. At the beginning of the year, they beheaded 600 Hu people. They should have returned to the capital to report their success, but it is clear that Yi Zhong is also worried about the palace suspecting him, so he left the group in Dingzhou and did not return to the capital when the emperor was not present. He gently clenched the fist in his sleeve, wanting to speak but then hesitating. Yen Ruohai glanced at his son curiously and said, "You're not usually like this. If you have something to say, then say it." A faint suspicion rose to Yan Bingyun's frosty face. "I don't know if the emperor's safety can be confirmed." "What danger is there?" Yen Ruohai furrowed his brows. The Qing kingdom has 7 roads of elite soldiers. The 3 roads you suspect cannot get close to Dong Mountain. They are all under the council's watch. What about Yan Xiaoyi? Yan Bingyun stared coldly into his father's eyes. It was as if he wanted to see something else in them. Yan Ruohai very naturally turned his head and avoided his son's gaze. What about Governor Yan? There was a problem with the Tsangzhou victory. Yan Bingyun lowered his voice. I said that there was a problem with the Tsangzhou victory. The secret agents searching for military contributions have already reported back. Although the heads were disguised, there are some problems. You are the head of the 4th Bureau and have taken over my job. You should know that although killing people and stealing military contributions is a major crime, it has never been completely eradicated, particularly when it comes to these border generals. They require the court's additional rewards to balance out the misery of the cold border, Yan Ruohai said coldly. Besides, even if Yan Xiaoyi lied about his military contributions, what does it have to do with the emperor on Dong Mountain? Don't forget, Northern Qi's letter has already arrived. Would the Northern Qi people act with Governor Yan? That's what I'm afraid of, Yan Bingyun said coldly. Yan Bingyun coldly said, if it was just killing people and stealing military contributions, then that's fine. If this matter has something to do with Northern Qi, then I'm afraid it won't be so simple. Yan Ruohai slowly stood up and stared into his son's eyes. Enunciating each word, he said, do you know what you are saying? Do you think that just because the director and the commissioner let you temporarily take charge of council affairs, you are the most remarkable person in the world? That you can see through all the tricks in the world? Even if Governor Yan and the Northern Qi people are acting, what problem is there? What problem? Yan Bingyun looked at his father. A fire of anger burned in his chest. He angrily said, 5,000 people died in the Northern Expedition Army. Is this a great victory? 8,000 beheaded. I'm afraid more than half of it is fake. Did those 5,000 people die or not? If they didn't die, then where did the 5,000 people who disappeared without a trace go? He pointed at the table and the non-existent map of the Qing kingdom's borders. He angrily said, Father, although the northern expedition camp is between Tsangzhou and Yanjing, if we draw a straight line, it is less than 500 li from Dong Mountain. If these 5,000 people, who should have died, suddenly appear at the foot of Dong Mountain, what do we do? Yan Ruohai furrowed his brows. After a moment of silence, he suddenly said in a cold voice, Idiot! Although it is not far from Tsangzhou to Dongshan Road, one has to go around Shao Mountain. No one knows how many provinces they have to pass through. The distance is also more than 1,000 li. Do you think 5,000 people can go so deep into the country without a sound? What if they don't go around? Yan Bingyun did not yield an inch in front of his father. He spoke of all the confusion that had lingered in his heart these days. If Dongyi opened its gates and allowed those 5,000 dead people to pass through the vassal states, then what? What to do 2 in a row did not make Yan Ruohai nervous. He looked at his son and smiled coldly. Idiot! Even if those 5,000 people had truly become death soldiers as you say, even if Sigujian was as stupid as you to open the country's gates and not be afraid of the Qing army, have you thought about it? From Dongyi to Dong Mountain, one has to pass through Danzhou. No one can climb the high mountains and precipitous cliffs to the north of Danzhou. This was the truth. It was a truth that had been proven by maps, human eyes, and manpower. The primitive forests and mountain peaks to the north of Danzhou were not something mortals could climb, much less an army of 5,000 people. No one has been able to climb over before, but that doesn't mean that no one will ever be able to. Yan Bingyun thought of the geography and environment. His imposing manner weakened slightly, but he still did not give up. Straightforwardly, he said, Besides, who knows if there are any secret passages in those mountains? Secret passages? Do you think this is a novel published by Dombo Bookstore? Yen Ruohai laughed coldly and prepared to walk out of the study. Seeing his father's completely unconcerned expression, Yen Bingyun finally couldn't resist. He slammed his palm onto the table with a loud bang and said angrily, "I don't know if what I'm worried about is a novel. I only know that what the Overwatch Council is doing right now is a joke. Regardless of whether or not this will happen, since there is already a point of suspicion, I will report it according to the Council's procedures. Why has the director suppressed this matter?" Hearing these words, Yen Ruohai's body shook. He slowly turned around and looked at his son with a complicated gaze. Yen Bingyun thought that his father had finally been convinced by him. A wave of relief rose in his heart. Unexpectedly, Yen Ruohai shook his sleeve and left the study. Summoning his trusted guards, he coldly said, "The young master is not feeling well. Have him stay in the manor to rest. Don't let him take a step out." The guards accepted the order in a low voice. After Yen Bingyun paused, a chill seeped into his heart. Staring at his father's back, he suddenly thought of the conversation he had with his father a long time ago. For a moment, he couldn't speak. That day, he asked his father, "If, and I'm saying if, you had to choose between the palace and the council, what would you choose?" At the time, Yen Ruohai had looked at him with an amused gaze and sighed. "Silly child, naturally I would choose the council. If the old director did not have this confidence in me, why would he say so much to you?" Yen Bingyun took a step towards the door and was stopped by a guard who was highly skilled in martial arts. He did not put up any unnecessary struggle. He only sighed and asked his father, "Where are you going?" Yen Ruohai turned around and looked at his son with a smile. "Since you're sick, I have to go to the council to ask for leave for you." Yen Bingyun didn't say anything more. He was loyal to the emperor and the court. He had already done what he needed to do. After all, he was an official of the Overwatch Council. As his father's son, he could not do more. The Yi family is indeed too quiet. Yi Zhong is indeed too obedient. Offering a prisoner, such a good opportunity to enter the capital, yet he just let it go. Sitting in the wheelchair, Chen Pingping shook his head and said, "Of course, he is also afraid that the palace will be wary of him and something will go wrong ahead of time. However, the second prince must be muttering in his heart. He thinks that the crown prince is about to be deposed. If the crown prince acts blindly at this time, the second prince, with the support of the Yi family, will certainly be able to hold the fort alone. He is probably hoping for his father-in-law to return soon. Right now, everyone wants to act. No one has the ability or courage to be the first to act." The old man smiled slightly as he pushed the wheelchair over from the black cloth. "If you want to destroy yourself, you must make yourself crazy. The eldest princess is crazy enough." Yen Ruohai smiled and understood Director Chen's meaning. "But, you are in the capital. Even if she has thoughts, she will have to wait for news from there." Chen Pingping smiled slightly and said, "Our mighty emperor will certainly give the eldest princess a pleasant surprise. As for the news she is waiting for, she may never get it." "But what about Yen Xiaoi's 5,000 elite soldiers?" Yen Ruohai furrowed his brows. "I still don't understand this. Even if he risked his life to save these 5,000 soldiers into the country, how would he transport them to the foot of Dong Mountain?" Yen Xiaoi's actions in the Tsangzhou victory were done very well. Who would have thought that Yen Bingyun would still be able to see through it? Chen Pingping said with praise. "This child is truly not bad." Yen Ruohai forced a smile and said, "Usually, he pretends to be as cold as ice. When something big really happens, he still feels uneasy. He is not you or me. He doesn't know the emperor's plans." Chen Pingping sighed. "It is normal for him to be suspicious of you and me. After the matter, how will we explain it to the palace? The emperor didn't want to beat the grass and startle the snake. Of course, the council cannot react to Yen Xiaoi's actions ahead of time." Chen Pingping coughed and thought to himself that whether or not there would be an incident was the problem that needed to be considered. After Yen Ruohai left, the old cripple in the wheelchair pushed the wheelchair back to the window out of habit. Looking outside through the black cloth, the corners of his mouth twitched slightly. He thought that there was indeed a secret path from the vassal states of Dongyi through the mountains and through Danzhou to Dong Mountain. He knew about it, and the emperor also knew about it. However, looking at it now, the eldest princess also knew about it. Even if 5,000 people went, they would only be able to surround the entire mountain peak. At most, they would be able to control the transmission of information from the sacrificial ceremony. The only important thing in this entire matter was probably on that mountain peak. Chen Pingping used his withered right hand to scratch his grizzled hair. He thought to himself that he had missed something. Fan Xian had run to the summit. He could only hope that he would be lucky and not lose his life for no reason in that earth-shattering incident. The emperor had prepared a large surprise for the eldest princess and Yi Luyun. Was the eldest princess not going to prepare a surprise for the emperor? Chen Pingping tilted his head and leaned weakly against the wheelchair. He felt the taste of life slowly leave his body. However, he became excited because of the images that appeared in his mind. It was as if he had once again found some of the elements that had made him excited and fascinated in the past. The agitation in his mind caused him to cough. Although it was an incomparably satisfying cough, it also caused waves of pain in his chest. He subconsciously pressed the secret bell on the desk, only to discover that the person who opened the door was not Fei Jie. Only now did he remember that Fei Jie had already followed his wishes and left the troublesome Qin kingdom. At this time, he should already be in Chuanzhou, preparing to live the life that the old poison had long yearned for overseas. "I'm coughing a little. Find some medicine to take." Chen Pingping smiled slightly at his subordinate who had just entered. If he could live another 2 years, then he would live another 2 years. The subordinate was overwhelmed by the favor and left with the order. Just as the emperor on the summit had guessed, as long as the eldest princess Li Yunrui did not die physically, she would always be able to find hidden power in Jingdou. At this moment, she was under house arrest in the side courtyard of the royal family. The people of the Overwatch Council were responsible for monitoring the outside, but her life was still maintained at a very luxurious standard. What was even more unexpected was that the Xinyang strategist, Yuan Hongdao, who had fled Jingdou for many months, had appeared in the side courtyard and sat in front of the eldest princess. No one knew how the eldest princess had done it. Even a blind person can see what the emperor is thinking. However, I don't know exactly where his confidence comes from. Li Yunrui's appearance was still beautiful, and her eyes were still charming and full of emotion. However, a truly attentive person could see that there was a slight change in her state of mind. Underneath the full emotion was a coldness carved deep in her heart. Chapter 524. In the quiet side courtyard of the royal family, a guard was patrolling outside the window. He seemed to be blind and deaf, unable to hear or see anything. The eldest princess, an important target of the royal family's surveillance, was secretly plotting something with her trusted aide. He is too suspicious, so there is no need to plan anything. He will jump out and plan it himself. Li Yunrui slowly closed her eyes. Furthermore, he is very arrogant to the point that he can beat him at his own game. What nonsense! How could there be a plan? He's just playing by himself. She suddenly opened her eyes and said, however, I am afraid that brother will be lonely, so I can only play with him. The assassination on Dong Mountain seems to have become an absurd matter on the surface. He knows I want to kill him and is waiting for me to kill him. I know he is waiting for me to kill him, but I still want to kill him. It is truly interesting. Yuan Hongdao listened to this tongue twister and looked at the smile at the corners of the eldest princess' lips. He did not find it interesting. On the contrary, he felt a faint chill. She knew that Dong Mountain was a trap, yet the eldest princess had jumped in without a second thought. Did she really think that Yi Luyun, a great grandmaster, could change the entire world? Although he had become Li Yunrui's closest strategist after Huang Yi's death, he knew that although the eldest princess seemed to have been forced back step by the emperor and Fan Xian these 2 years and had never been able to do anything, in terms of strategy, there was not much she needed him for. Because of this, he had never figured out the details of the eldest princess' final plan. Naturally, he had no way to report it to the director and the emperor. As a strategist, at such a critical moment, regardless of whether it was for disguise or to gain more trust, Yuan Hongdao had to say some suggestions. Thus, he gazed into the eldest princess' eyes and quietly said, "Interesting. At certain times, it is the combination of absurdity and stupidity. I don't know which side is more absurd and which side is more stupid. Since the first to move was the emperor, then you should choose the other path. Otherwise, no matter how you move, your chess piece will always be one step slower than the person on the stone platform." The eldest princess Li Yunrui slowly closed her eyes. After a long silence, she said, "The other path? You're advising me not to move for now." "Yes." The eldest princess suddenly opened her eyes and smiled. Her smile was extremely pure and innocent. "What's the use of not moving? If the worship to heaven on Dong Mountain successfully ends, there will come a time when Mother will go. Do you expect me to be imprisoned in this courtyard forever?" Yuan Hongdao was silent for a moment, then smiled. Since he could easily enter this courtyard, then the eldest princess must have many ways to easily leave this courtyard. He knew that the eldest princess was only thinking about the future of the Qin kingdom. No matter how you looked at it, if the emperor did not take advantage of this opportunity to leave the capital, what chance would the eldest princess have to stage a comeback? Fan Xian. Yuan Hongdao tried to persuade the eldest princess. Before he received further instructions from the council, he wanted to delay the eldest princess's actions as much as possible. "This is your chance, Fan Xian." The eldest princess became interested and smiled slightly. "Even if the emperor wants to take away Fan Xian's power in the future, this will not be my opportunity. It is not as simple as taking away power." Yuan Hongdao lowered his voice and said. "Fan Xian's relationship with the North is too close. Once the emperor has pacified the internal conflicts in the court, he will certainly point his blade at Northern Qi. What Fan Xian will do at this time is worth considering. Perhaps that will be your opportunity." "So I have to live?" The eldest princess smiled self-mockingly. "You have to live." She smiled lazily and did not comment. Her orchid-like finger tapped the teacup on the table. As Yuan Hongdao rose to pour her tea, she slowly lowered her face and thought quietly. Yuan Hongdao's thoughts were not wrong. However, he did not understand what kind of person the emperor was. In this world, only the eldest princess, Li Yunrui, knew best what kind of person her brother the emperor was. Only she knew that the emperor was giving her an opportunity. If she did not take advantage of this opportunity, there was no need to mention any future matters. The emperor had too many opportunities to kill her, but he did not. Naturally, he hoped to use her to draw out some people. The people of the Juanshang conference who had long been hidden in court, some strange old creature. She thought to herself that if she won, it wouldn't be a big deal. Even if she lost, it would be good if the emperor could achieve his goal. Thinking of this, a glimmer of a self-mocking smile once again appeared at the corners of her lips. "Brother Hong, what do you think is the final competition in killing?" The eldest princess looked at him with a slight smile. Yuan Hongdao thought for a bit and then said, "Time, opportunity, and the general trend." "Correct, but also wrong." The eldest princess slowly lowered her head and said. "Actually, in the end, it's just a competition of the crudest, most boring, and most direct things, to see whose saber is faster, and who has more fighters. Fighting for the throne is actually not fundamentally different from fighting for territory between gangs on the Jianghu. The emperor is overly suspicious and thinks that he can scheme against the world, but he has forgotten one thing. Not all the knives are in his hands. Don't forget what I said before. Because of his suspicions, he will, without a doubt, lose. The eldest princess' cold words set the tone for this entire matter. Yuan Hongdao smiled. He knew he could no longer convince the eldest princess, so he couldn't help but feel a bit anxious. However, he hid it well and said, "The crown prince and second prince are almost done contacting them. Once the news arrives, they will begin to make arrangements. There shouldn't be any problems with the civil officials. Tragic news is always the best to strike at the civil officials' hearts. No matter what angle you look at it from, they have no reason to refuse." "What you say is very reasonable," the eldest princess said with a slight smile. The eldest princess smiled slightly and said, "The Overwatch Council cannot see the light. They are a powerful tool, but at times they can never become a decisive force. With only the support of the officials and the support of the palace, what use can Chen Pingping have?" She then smiled slightly and said, "I heard that Wan'er has been taking care of the concubine who is about to give birth. Make arrangements for this matter." On the peak of Dong Mountain, Fan Xian stood outside the door and looked at the person sitting on the prayer mat. The blind man was covered by a black cloth. His figure was not very large, but he always appeared calm. He opened his mouth but didn't say anything. The emperor laughed and turned to leave, leaving this place to the uncle and nephew. Fan Xian walked in and carefully closed the door. After confirming that no one was eavesdropping, he allowed a joyful expression to overflow on his face. He hugged the blind man and gently patted his back. Wu Zhu still had that cold expression. This coldness was different from Sir Yen Jr.'s. It was not an expression of self-protection. Rather, it was a feeling brought about by the absolute calmness of one's heart. When Fan Xian hugged him tightly and was about to go mad with joy, the corners of the blind man's mouth opened slightly behind Fan Xian's head and revealed a rare warm smile. Unfortunately, Fan Xian did not see it. Otherwise, he would certainly do something strange. Wu Zhu was not someone who liked to be physically intimate with others. Fan Xian was also the same. However, meeting again after a long time, Fan Xian was unable to suppress the joy in his heart and embraced to his heart's content. The two of them sat separately on the prayer mats and looked at each other. They were silent for a long time and didn't speak. Fan Xian's expression became gentler and happier. He confirmed that the blind man's injuries were more or less healed. For a moment, he didn't know what to say or where to start. Ever since they parted a year and a half ago, he had gone south to Jiangnan to fight the Ming family, been ambushed in the valley, and killed people overnight in Jingdou. He had gone through countless dangerous situations. However, none of this was what Uncle Wu Zhu wanted to hear. These things were nothing to Wu Zhu. What was the Ming family? Wu Zhu did not care at all. As for the danger of being ambushed in the valley, Wu Zhu would only think that Fan Xian's performance was very poor. After holding it in for a long time, Fan Xian opened his mouth and said, "Uncle, I'm going to be a father." After hearing these words, Wu Zhu, whose expression did not change even under the pressure of Dong Mountain, fell into a rare silence. It was as if he was slowly digesting this news. Then, he tilted his head slightly and said, "You're also going to have a child?" No one knew how much information was contained in this word. For Wu Zhu, there were only two people in this world. Although there were tens of thousands of people, there were only two people to him. Nothing else existed. Only the matters of these two people were worthy of him remembering. 20 years ago, the woman had a child. 20 years later, the child the woman gave birth to was going to have a child. Although the two events were separated by 20 years, in his feeling, it was like two things had happened one after another. Thus, there was the word also. Then, A warm smile bloomed once again at the corners of his lips. Very seriously, he said to Fan Xian, "Congratulations." Because of this smile and these two words, Fan Xian sank into boundless shock and joy. He could not understand how, after not seeing Uncle Wu Zhu for more than a year, he would say such a vulgar word and not hesitate to show his most human side in front of him. When was the last time he had seen Uncle Wu Zhu smile? Probably when he was still in that grocery store in Danzhou talking about his mother. For some reason, Fan Xian's heart was warm. It was as if he felt that Wu Zhu was finally willing to smile for him, and not just because of Yi Qingmei. This was something worth remembering. Wu Zhu's smile immediately disappeared and returned to his usual appearance. "Seriously," he said, "when you're going to have a child, you have to say congratulations. This is what the lady taught me. I haven't forgotten, so don't be surprised." Fan Xian smiled bitterly and was speechless. He opened his mouth and said, "This should be an emotion that comes from the heart. We don't need to remember it." Wu Zhu's face faced the mural in the temple and said, "For me, this is a very difficult thing. For you, you are celebrating too early." The thin and absolutely opaque black cloth was tied around his eyes, making the bridge of his nose appear particularly straight. What he said next was also very direct. "The time is not right." The meaning of this sentence was too simple and too mysterious. A normal person would certainly not understand. But Fan Xian had lived with Wu Zhu since he was a child, so he easily understood the meaning contained in these 4 words. He laughed bitterly and nodded his head, acknowledging Uncle Wu Zhu's judgment. The emperor was worshipping heaven on Dong Mountain. If someone actually dared to rebel, then Dong Mountain would be the most dangerous place in the world. Correspondingly, Jingdou would be the second most dangerous place in the world. Fan Xian was far away by the seaside, and had no way to worry about the situation in Jingdou. If the eldest princess and the princes truly had the courage to do such a thing, then what kind of methods would they use against Fan Xian, who appeared to be loyal to the emperor? Wan was the eldest princess' own daughter, so Fan Xian was not too worried. But what about Cece and the child about to be born in her stomach? Even if the emperor had gained a great advantage on Dong Mountain, once Jingdou fell into chaos, what kind of harm would the people in the Fan Manor, the people Fan Xian worried about, suffer? This was the root of Fan Xian's shock and worry after seeing the emperor in Danzhou. However, in front of the emperor, he could not express anything. Only after Wu Zhu directly spoke of the root of the problem did his expression reveal the true emotions in his heart. It was a heavy one. The director and father are in the capital. There shouldn't be any major problems. He seemed to want to convince Uncle Wu Zhu but also to comfort himself. The emperor has not allowed Chen Pingping and Fan Jian to control the army. This is a problem. Wu Zhu's words still did not have any inferences, only results. He lowered his head and coldly said, "If you hurry back to Jingdou right now, perhaps you can still make it in time." Even if there were people in Jingdou rebelling, they still needed a reason. They had to find a scapegoat for the emperor's assassination. Thus, the time of the change in Jingdou had to be around 15 days after the Dong Mountain incident. If Fan Xian rushed back to Jingdou now, he should still make it in time. Wu Zhu said, "It's useless for you to be here." Fan Xian thought for a moment and then suddenly said, "My purpose seems to have been completed the moment I saw you." Ascending Dong Mountain and entering the old temple, the moment he saw Wu Zhu, Fan Xian understood why the emperor had ordered him to accompany him to worship heaven, why he had stopped him in Danzhou, and why he had brought him to Dong Mountain. Just as the emperor had said earlier, since this plan was targeted at Yi Luyun, he needed Wu Zhu's participation. Not only would Wu Zhu not leave Dong Mountain because of the emperor's plan, but even if he was on Dong Mountain, if he didn't want to attack Yi Luyun, he wouldn't attack. The emperor could order everyone under heaven, but he could not order Wu Zhu. Thus, the emperor needed Fan Xian's help to persuade Wu Zhu to participate in this matter. Presumably, you know why the Emperor brought me to see you, Fan Xian said with his head lowered as he looked at Wu Zhu. You also know, Wu Zhu said. Fan Xian slowly raised his head. There was a complicated expression on his face. A moment later, he said, I've been in the capital for 3.5 years. I've done many things. In reality, I know that these things were all done by someone using me. Now, those people are using me to use you. It's fine with me because I have my own desires. But you have no desires in this world, so this is unfair to you. There is no such thing as fairness or unfairness in this world, Wu Zhu said calmly. What is important is whether or not this matter benefits you. Fan Xian noticed something strange. After being separated from Uncle Wu Zhu for more than a year, the blind uncle seemed to be much more talkative than before. His expression was much more varied. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. The Emperor has thrown himself into this dangerous situation. If we don't help him and he is actually killed by Yi Liuyun's sword, things will get serious. He is using his own life and the turmoil of the world to force us to help him. Even if we don't care about these two things, I have to care about the safety of those people in Jingdou. Fan Xian paused and then smiled bitterly. If Yi Liyun acts, the eldest princess and the second prince will certainly have reached an agreement in Jingdou. We can't let them succeed. Wu Zhu was silent for a moment and then said, Speak frankly. Fan Xian sat down in front of him and said sincerely, Uncle, please protect the Emperor's life. As for Yi Liyun, don't worry about him. Wu Zhu nodded straightforwardly. Fan Xian let out a breath in his heart. The Emperor could use him, but he didn't want to use Uncle Wu Zhu. He only had a few family members in this world. He didn't want too many other things mixed in. Letting Uncle Wu Zhu act did not mean that Fan Xian wasn't worried about his safety. The strange activity before the heaven worship would certainly be the greatest tremor in this land in 20 years. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu had the cultivation of a great grandmaster, he might not be able to get away with it. However, Fan Xian was not very worried because this temple was on the precipice of a high mountain. Even if Uncle Wu Zhu lost in the end, he could just jump into the ocean. With this trick, Yi Liyun and those big shots would not be able to catch up even if they whipped their horses. I should go down the mountain right now, Fan Xian said with his head lowered. In the major event that was about to happen, he didn't have much right to speak. Furthermore, in the depths of his heart, he didn't want to follow the Emperor in this crazy risk. He knew that the Emperor probably wouldn't let him leave the mountain. Only by using this method of kidnapping hostages could he move Uncle Wu Zhu to work for him. If Yi Liuyun's sword occasionally turned and pointed at Fan Xian, Wu Zhu would have no choice but to act even if he didn't want to. If the other party makes a move, it will certainly be before the heaven worship is complete. In a moment, I will try to convince the Emperor to let me leave the mountain. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. After this matter is over, please come find me as soon as possible. Speaking of this matter, he looked at Uncle Wu Zhu's face and asked in a daze, I don't know what is so special about the heaven worship ceremony or what symbolic meaning it has, but I am curious. Uncle, have you been recovering on Dong Mountain this year? Wu Zhu nodded. Everyone says that the Great Dong Mountain is magical. Is it true? Fan Xian looked at the black cloth on his face and asked with furrowed brows. Wu Zhu opened his mouth and said, I don't know if it's useful for those people's illnesses, but it's very beneficial for my recovery. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He didn't quite understand these words and asked, Why? The yuanqi on Dong Mountain is thicker than anywhere else in the world, Wu Zhu said. Fan Xian's brows furrowed even tighter. I can't feel it. You can only feel the zhenqi in your body, Wu Zhu said. The yuanqi between heaven and earth is not so easily captured. He paused for a moment and then said, he once practiced Western magic. He should be able to feel it. Fan Xian was silent. He suddenly thought of the two useless sorcerers who had occasionally appeared in his life. He seemed to have vaguely guessed something, but he was unable to connect all the clues together. Magic, this was such a distant and unfamiliar term. When he was young, he had once thought of cultivating magic, but on this land, no one was proficient in it. Even Ku-he, who was more of a collection and research of theoretical knowledge. The night gradually deepened. The temperature at the top of the mountain slowly dropped. The insects in the grass were so cold that they stopped chirping. A somber aura gradually condensed between the temples. Fan Xian raised his face in a daze and looked at the murals painted on the four walls of the temple. The pictures were similar to those in the Qing temple in Jingdo. It made him slightly absent-minded. Fan Xian was filled with curiosity toward the temple and the Qing temple that followed its style. He had wanted to ask Uncle Wu Zhu, but the pressing situation made it impossible for him to stay for too long. He stood up and bowed to Wu Zhu. Lowering his voice, he said, "On this mountaintop, it doesn't matter who dies, but you cannot die." Wu Zhu didn't reply. He tilted his ear and then extended his right hand from his sleeve. He pressed it directly to the ground and didn't move at all. A moment later, Wu Zhu quietly said, "You won't be able to get down the mountain. You've convinced him." The emperor held his hands behind his back and stood at the edge of the pitch-black cliff. There were clouds in the sky, hiding the moon behind a thick layer of clouds. The distant blue ocean below the cliff was suffused with a dark color like ink. One could faintly see 1 or 2 weak spots of light. They should be the Jiaozhou Navy's escorting ships. Fan Xian walked behind the emperor and furrowed his brows slightly. In the afternoon, he had almost fallen off. How exactly did the emperor train his courage? However, the situation was urgent. He didn't reply to the emperor's question. Straightforwardly, he said, "Your Majesty, there are riders attacking from the foot of the mountain." The emperor slowly turned around with a slight smile on his face. He didn't question how Fan Xian knew what was happening at the foot of the mountain from the top. Gently he said, "Is that so? How many people are there?" "I'm not sure." Fan Xian lowered his head and replied, "I think that since the enemy is attacking, we should immediately send out the Tiger Guards to break out and ask for help." The emperor looked at him calmly and didn't reply to his words. He only slowly said, "I have something else for you to do." At the foot of the mountain, a fire arrow shot through the night sky with a whoosh. It lit up a bit of the sky and reported the urgent enemy situation at the foot of the mountain. At the foot of the mountain, the sounds of killing had probably shaken the heavens and blood and flesh flying everywhere. The curtains had been drawn on the most daring act of regicide in the history of the Qin kingdom. Report. The deputy commander of the imperial army ran out of the camp at the top of the mountain and knelt in front of the emperor. He quickly reported what had happened at the foot of the mountain. However, the distance between the summit and the foot of the mountain was very far. It was impossible to completely understand the specific situation with just a few command arrows. The deputy commander's face was deathly pale. He was drenched in sweat in the cold night wind. He only knew that there was an enemy attack at the foot of the mountain. This reality was enough for him to lose his head. He truly couldn't understand how these attacking troops had come to the foot of Dong Mountain without alerting the local government. Under the cover of the night, they had launched a fierce and tragic attack on the 2,000 imperial soldiers at the foot of the mountain. There was no specific content. Fan Xian watched as the deputy commander's lips moved up and down. It was like he couldn't hear a single word in his ears. It was like an absurd and laughable soundless scene. It was indeed laughable. The ruler of a country was surrounded on Dong Mountain deep within the country. The sound of killing could not reach the high summit of the mountain. The stench of blood also could not float up. The summit of Dong Mountain was still clear and bright. In the night sky very close to the summit, the thick layer of clouds suddenly dissipated and revealed a bright moon. The moonlight was like a silver ray shining on the emperor and Fan Xian's bodies at the summit. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes slightly and looked at the Emperor's godlike figure enveloped in the moonlight. He began to feel nervous and excited. Through the Emperor's iron-like shoulders, he saw a small boat floating in the distance on the ocean. The small boat rose and fell in the wave. Leisurely moving forward in the moonlight, it headed toward Dong Mountain. The summit of the mountain was far from the ocean, but Fan Xian still felt the small boat. Yi Lu Yun was standing on the boat. Chapter 525. The moon was as cold as water. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and looked at the distant foot of the mountain and the distant seaside. He saw the small boat gently sinking and floating in the ink-like water. His internal strength was tyrannical and his eyesight was astonishing. He still could not clearly see the situation on the boat. Strangely, it was as if he could see the old man on the boat, that straw hat, and that wisp of beard from so far away. Of the 4 great grandmasters in the world, he had only seen Yi Lu Yun. Once when he was young and once in Suzhou. Each time, he was stunning. Yi Lu Yun was a free and easy person, a very free and easy person. Tonight, he had come riding a boat through the waves with a sword in hand. His aura had not yet arrived, but his elegance was already enough to make one's heart tremble. Fan Xian looked at the boat in the ocean and thought of the great grandmaster who had floated alone on the boat and charged toward Dong Mountain. Even though there were thousands of people in front of him, he couldn't help but feel deeply moved. A glimmer of respect grew in his heart for no reason. The small boat appeared close but was actually very far. It bathed in the moonlight on the shore of an antenna and slowly moved toward this side. It was as if it would never get close to this shore. Fan Xian knew that the furthest distance in the world was not the distance between life and death. Thus, this small boat, which was about to determine the life and death of countless people, would eventually reach the shore. At the foot of the mountain, on the side facing away from the shore, dots of fire suddenly appeared. Although they were dots of fire, the light was enough to reach the summit of the mountain. It could be imagined that on the battlefield there, powerful rebel soldiers had appeared like ghosts and were desperately attacking the line of defense of the Imperial Army. The power of the fire when they burned the camp had already grown to an uncontrollable level. Fortunately, there was a lot of rain in the summer. Additionally, the sea wind blew and the mountain was very humid. There was no need to worry that this fire would directly burn Dong Mountain into a charred pillar and burn everyone on the mountain to death. A few more mournful signal arrows shot into the sky. They only reached halfway up the mountain before falling miserably and dispiritedly and powerlessly. It was at this time that the Imperial Army's line of defense at the foot of the mountain found it difficult to continue and almost couldn't hold out much longer. The little boat had not yet arrived, but the powerful enemies had already reached the foot of the mountain. The Qing Emperor and his group all had their backs to the sea. Standing in front of the stone railings for viewing the scenery, they silently watched the activity at the foot of the mountain, watched the fires that burned and died, and listened to the faint sounds of killing. However, they were still too far away. When the sounds of battle reached the peak of the mountain, they were blown by the wind and rustled by the branches of the trees. It actually became a somewhat distorted rhythmic beat. There was no killing intent. At least, the people on the summit of the mountain did not feel this kind of atmosphere. In comparison, the little boat slowly drifting over from the ocean behind Dong Mountain brought more nervousness to the people. At this time, the minister of the Board of Rites, the officials of Taichung Temple, and the other officials who had come to worship heaven had long walked out of their rooms and followed behind the silent emperor. Each of them was shocked and terrified, but no one dared to say anything. The deputy commander of the Imperial Army had long charged down the mountain, prepared to fight to the death on the front line. However, before he arrived, the 2,000 soldiers of the Imperial Army would probably have already become wandering spirits in the night and corpses in the mountains. Fan Xian felt a slight bitterness in his mouth. He unconsciously stuck out his tongue to lick his dry lip. A glimmer of shock grew uncontrollably in his heart. Where did this army at the foot of the mountain come from? Why didn't the Overwatch Council's network on Shandong Road detect anything ahead of time? Why didn't the 500 Black Knights placed in the Shao Mountain area have any effect? Was the other party able to sneak to the foot of Dong Mountain without anyone noticing? What shocked him the most was the situation at the foot of the mountain. Seeing the flames retreating, listening to the rise and fall of the sounds of killing, and judging from the signal arrows, he knew that the Imperial army could no longer hold out. The 2,000 Imperial soldiers were about to be defeated so quickly. Although the Imperial army was stationed in Jingdo and could not compare to the Dingzhou army, Northern Expedition Camp, and the Seven Roads of Armies in terms of field battle ability, ever since the Great Prince had been transferred to the position of commander of the Imperial Army, he had transferred many key generals from the original Western Expedition Army. The Imperial Army's strength had been effectively replenished. Even if they were not a match for those armies, they would not be defeated so quickly. After Fan Xian was shocked, a glimmer of confusion welled up in his heart. Whose family did the attacking army belong to? It's Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp. The emperor stood by the stone railing and looked in the direction of the foot of the mountain. Although it was clear that he could not see clearly what was happening below, he saw a glimmer of unease in Fan Xian and old eunuch Hong's eyes. Coldly, he said, "The Imperial army is not a match for them." Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp? Fan Xian furrowed his brows. He immediately thought of the strange Tsangzhou victory between Tsangzhou and Yanjing a month ago. Although he still didn't know what method Yan Xiaoyi had used to send these soldiers to the foot of Dong Mountain, since the enemy had already arrived, thinking about it now was a waste of time. You are the commissioner of the Overwatch Council. An army has traveled thousands of li to carry out an attack deep inside the country. What crime is that? The emperor looked at Fan Xian and asked with a slight smile. Fan Xian laughed bitterly. He knew that the emperor was joking. However, the situation at the foot of the mountain was so dangerous. He was not in the mood to joke. He replied, "Even if there is a secret passage to the north of Danzhou, the Overwatch Council should have received news of it. Thus, I think that someone in the council is helping him." The emperor smiled and didn't say anything. There was an additional glimmer of self-mockery in his smile. Fan Xian saying that there was a problem in the council was honest and also a test. He wanted to test whether or not the elite group at the foot of the mountain, killing like tigers and wolves, Yan Xiaoyi's trusted camp, had been purposely let there by the emperor. Looking at the emperor's confident expression and calm posture, Fan Xian believed this deduction in the depths of his heart. However, the emperor's smile appeared very helpless. "I want to know the specific situation at the foot of the mountain," the emperor suddenly said coldly. "I don't want to be blind." Back then, the emperor had personally led the army to fight north and south. He had made illustrious achievements in battle and could be called the foremost general in the land. However, he had not personally gone into battle for almost 20 years. That was why Shang Shanhu, who was fighting the barbarians in northern Qi, had gradually overshadowed the monarch's military glory. In the situation of the royal entourage being surrounded, if the emperor could personally command the imperial army, presumably, the imperial army at the foot of the mountain would not have been defeated so wretchedly. However, even though there was a bright moon hanging high in the night, going up and down the mountain was not as joyful as singing folk songs. Sending orders took a long time, much less personally commanding. Thus, the emperor's expression was icy and his tone was not friendly. This slight unfriendliness did not frighten the people by the emperor's side to death. In such a situation, the emperor was sufficiently calm that he did not fly into a rage and chop off the heads of the officials by his side. Fan Xian slowly lowered his head and gently touched the index and ring fingers of both of his hands, forming a bridge. In an instant, he circulated all the tyrannical Jinqi in his body, urging the two circulations in his body that were different from everyone else's to circulate quickly. He forced his six senses to the clearest realm. In an instant, the aura on his body grew greatly, stirring up a gust of wind on the summit of the mountain. The sand and stones moved slightly. The tiger guards guarding the emperor's side were startled. At such a sensitive moment, they all made defensive movements. Only old eunuch Hong was standing behind the emperor in a half-asleep state. A moment later, Fan Xian respectfully reported, "Your Majesty, it is a bit strange. The other party seems to have retreated." Hearing these words, the emperor's brows furrowed. A moment later, he faintly said, "Just how many people did he bring?" He dared to try to seal off the entire mountain and not let a single person out. Yan Xiaoi has a big appetite. The officials on the summit, including Fan Xian, were all confused. Only the emperor clearly determined the rebel army's intentions. They gave the imperial army a chance to regroup. They were afraid that the two sides would fight and enter a chaotic situation, leaving some survivors out of this large net. The rebel army at the foot of the mountain was prepared to not let a single person escape Dong Mountain and report to the surrounding provinces. "Impossible," Fan Xian said. He knew that according to the Overwatch Council's procedures, the 6th Bureau swordsmen mixed with the Imperial Army would find an opportunity at the first instant to break out of the heavy encirclement and inform the Dongshan Road government to urgently mobilize the provincial and nearest troops to come to their aid. Given the ability of the 6th Bureau swordsmen to move in the dark, even if there were tens of thousands of riders at the foot of the mountain, they would not be able to kill or capture all of these swordsmen. There would always be a few people that would be missed. A shadow-like gray-clothed man floated up from the 10,000 steps to heaven. This person's qigong was excellent, but his posture was strange. It was as if there was a spring installed in his knee joint. Each time he touched the ground, he bounced up gently. Although his posture was not as graceful as that of a powerful warrior, it was superior in that he was fast and quiet. Before the gray-clothed man reached the summit, countless snowflakes had already bloomed in the night sky. The tiger guards hiding around the emperor raised their long knives and chopped down. In an instant, they covered up the splendor of the moon. The gray-clothed man did not attack. He only held up a token. Under the moonlight and knife light, the token was very obvious. It was the token of the Overwatch Council. Eunuch Yao waved his hand. The tiger guards pulled back their knives, but they still revealed themselves. They surrounded the gray-clothed man in the center. A dozen long knives pointed in a threatening manner. Fan Xian believed that even if he was between these dozen long knives, he would only be able to run for his life. However, he took a step closer to the gray-clothed man with a questioning and worried expression on his face. The gray-clothed man was one of the two wings of the Overwatch Council, Wang Qinian. He was Fan Xian's trusted aide. When the sudden change occurred, he had led the Overwatch Council people to set up defenses at the foot of the mountain. He had long been shocked beyond words. He didn't say much to Fan Xian. Surrounded by the knife-wielding men, he knelt in front of the emperor and Fan Xian. In a low voice, he said, 5,000 rebel soldiers, armed with crossbows, all of them archers. At the same time, everyone on the summit fell silent because of this news. First of all, this news proved the emperor's judgment. The attacking rebel soldiers were Yan Xiaoi's trusted soldiers. Only a god of archery like Yan Xiaoi could train all of his trusted soldiers into 1 in 1,000 master archers. Although the distance of an arrow was not as far as a crossbow, it was faster than a crossbow. 5,000 master archers had attacked in the dark. It was said that Yan Xiaoi's trusted soldiers were all longbowmen. No wonder the Imperial Army and Overwatch Council people at the foot of the mountain had such difficulty resisting. The emperor looked at Wang Qinian kneeling in front of him and asked in a low voice, "How is the battle situation?" Wang Qinian's tone froze. He immediately replied, "When we were attacked, I went up the mountain. I do not know the current situation." The emperor huffed coldly but did not continue to express his dissatisfaction. It had not been long since the attack. The distance between the top and bottom of the mountain was very far. Other than the signal arrows, Wang Qinian was the first official to rush to the top of the mountain to report. Looking at his deathly pale face, one could tell that this short charge up the mountain had used up most of his spiritual and internal strength. 5,000 longbowmen. The emperor suddenly laughed coldly. They want to wipe out 2,000 imperial soldiers. Xiaoyi does not have such ambitions. I am truly curious who the master at the foot of the mountain is. The rebel soldiers had sealed the mountain and were not attacking. The situation was a bit strange. Fan Xian looked at Wang Qinian and straightforwardly asked, "Have we broken through?" The Overwatch Council acted according to protocol. If a superior asked a question, the subordinate knew what it was. Wang Qinian's expression changed slightly. He reported to Fan Xian, 17 members of the 6th Bureau, all dead. Fan Xian's expression did not change. "Are you sure?" "Yes." Wang Qinian lowered his head and reported. "I turned back halfway up the mountain. There were battles on the two quiet paths to the southwest and northwest. There were aces lying in ambush." Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. His heart ached for a moment. He forcefully pushed down the growing anger and sorrow. The 6th Bureau always walked in the dark. Among Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers, where would there be such swordsmen who were used to assassinations? To be able to kill all of his subordinates in the darkness proved that the assassins were of a much higher level than the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau. He then glanced deeply at Wang Qinian. Wang Qinian did not nod or shake his head. He only moved his right hand, which was on the ground, slightly. Fan Xian sighed in his heart. He knew that 13th Wang was fairly well behaved and relaxed a little. Turning to look at the emperor, he didn't hesitate. Without hesitation, he calmly said, "Your Majesty, Dongyi's people have also come." Hearing these words, the emperor did not react at all. It was as if he was waiting for something. A moment later, Eunuch Yao walked back from the stone steps and quietly said something by the emperor's ear. The emperor's expression gradually darkened. Only now did Fan Xian know that when the first warning arrow had risen, Eunuch Yao had already arranged for the Tiger Guards to begin breaking out of the encirclement and send a message. Now, he had received a report confirming that the breakout had failed. The swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council and the valiant Tiger Guards had twice tried to break out of the encirclement but had both failed. Just how many aces had Dongyi lent to the eldest princess? Had the Sword Hut, which produced the most 9th-level aces in the world, all gathered at the foot of Dong Mountain? Had Sigujian come? The night wind rose again on the summit of the mountain. The little boat on the distant ocean was still both far and near. The sounds of killing at the foot of the mountain gradually died down. The moonlight shone on the mountain woods but could not brush away the darkness in the woods. No one knew how much hidden killing intent was waiting for the people on the summit of the mountain. The emperor suddenly thought of the scene of Fan Xian circulating his qi earlier and coldly asked, "Your martial arts are getting better. Has the old illness from last year recurred?" Fan Xian didn't understand why the emperor would suddenly ask such an irrelevant question at this time. He replied, "It has not recurred." "Very good." The emperor calmly gazed at the vast land under the moonlight. "Then, I will leave this matter to you with peace of mind. Get out!" The emperor roared darkly and angrily. On the summit of the mountain, other than the emperor, Fan Xian, old eunuch Hong, and the Tiger Guards hidden in the darkness, everyone else obeyed the order and rolled back into their temples and residences, leaving this place empty for the emperor and the commissioner, the pitiful father and son. My journey to worship the heavens this time was a gamble. What I worship is the heavens, and what I gamble on is also the heavens. A seriousness flashed between the emperor's brows. I don't want to wait any longer, so I am gambling with my life. I am gambling on the fate of heaven. Whether it succeeds or fails, it is all within my calculations. If it succeeds, the Qing court will no longer have internal worries. Within 3 years, the sword will point to the world, and no one will dare to slow my steps. However, he did not say what would happen if he failed. Coldly, he said, "Perhaps I have calculated wrongly. Tonight, I lured Uncle Luyun up the mountain. I had thought those two people would not interfere. After all, this is the Qing kingdom breaking its own pillars. If it had been in the past, they would have stood by and watched." Fan Xian stood silently to the side. He was certain that the 9th-level aces from Dongyi were participating in the rebel army at the foot of the mountain. As for whether or not Sigujian would come, no one could guess. Even if that idiot comes, so what? However, the Emperor slowly closed his eyes and sighed. "I must consider what comes after, so you can go down the mountain." Fan Xian raised his head in surprise, not knowing how to respond. He had thought for a long time about how to convince the Emperor to let him go down the mountain. He had not expected the Emperor to bring up this idea himself. However, the paths down the mountain were all sealed. In addition to the terrifying 9th-level swordsman from Dongyi, how could he go down the mountain? The Emperor smiled mockingly and said, "Do you think I will drag you by my side and force Lao Wu to act?" Fan Xian smiled helplessly. The Emperor took a deep breath. It was as if he wanted to suck in all of the moonlight on the summit of the mountain into his chest. A moment later, he said in a cold voice, "Regardless of whether or not I succeed, Jingdo will certainly say I am dead. Thus, I want you to go down the mountain. I want you to go back." He looked calmly into Fan Xian's eyes and said, "Of my 4 sons, 2 of them are worse than pigs and dogs. Go back to the capital on my behalf and teach them a lesson. Don't disappoint me." The emotions in Fan Xian's heart were complicated. He then heard the Emperor's words that were even gentler than the sea breeze. "There is no need to stay here to gamble your life with me. Go back to the capital. If the outcome of the matter is not what I imagine, you can do whatever you want. You decide who sits in that chair." Fan Xian's heart shook. He was speechless. Chapter 526. There were 3 reasons for Fan Xian's shock. First, the Emperor sending him down the mountain contained a glimmer of pity for his son. It was truly unexpected. Second, the Emperor's words seemed to no longer have his usual confidence. Third, the Emperor's last words, "Who would sit in that chair and let him decide?" Were those last words or something else? The problem was, even if he was lucky and could make it back to Jingdo before the eldest princess announced the truth, what power did he have to turn his ideas into reality? This was not the Jiangnanming family, the Cui family, the court officials in Jingdo, or the pitiful people in the Imperial Observatory. It was the royal palace and the ownership of the world. A bitter smile appeared at the corners of Fan Xian's lips. Even if he was a powerful official in the Qin kingdom, he didn't have a single soldier in his hands. What could he use to help the Emperor stabilize Jingdo? What right did he have to decide the ownership of that chair? "I will not lose." A glimmer of a smile bloomed at the corners of the Emperor's lips. The smile was filled with cold, killing intent. "Even if I lose, if Yi Luyun and Sigujian accompany me in death, what is there to be afraid of? You don't have to worry. Director Chen is in Jingdo, and the Empress Dowager is in the palace. Those people won't be able to cause much trouble. Take my edict and my royal seal. If anyone dares to stop you, kill them all." Cold sweat beaded on Fan Xian's forehead. If the Yi and Qin families also rebelled, even if he was a great grandmaster, the most he could do was fight a guerrilla battle. How could he kill them all? He could already see the glimmer of uncertainty in the Emperor's heart. His mood couldn't help but grow dim. If the Emperor truly died on Dong Mountain, what would the world become? Regardless of whether it was the Crown Prince or the second prince succeeding, there would probably be no place for him in the Qin kingdom. Did he really have to hold on to that treasure bowl and take the second path? However, the situation had not reached its most dangerous moment. There was still old eunuch Hong and Uncle Wu Zhu on the mountaintop, as well as over 100 tiger guards. No matter what kind of powerful enemy they encountered, they would be able to hold out for a long time. There was only one way to forcefully climb Dong Mountain. The mission of the 5,000 longbowmen at the foot of the mountain was clearly to cut off Dong Mountain's connection to the rest of the world. It had to be cut off for at least 3 days to make time for the Jingdo incident. If they truly wanted to kill the emperor, these rebel soldiers would not be of any use. The emperor would not stupidly go down the mountain. And then, Yi Luyun would climb the mountain. This was indeed a gamble. If the situation of the three countries remained the same as before, the ruler of Qin Kingdom setting up a trap to kill Yi Luyun, Northern Qi and Dongyi would certainly be happy to see it succeed. Ku He and Sigujian would not cast aside their identities and interfere. But the cold sweat on Fan Xian's forehead had already dried. His body only felt cold. When he was in Wuzhou, his father-in-law Lin Ruofu had reminded him that for a sufficiently alluring and even somewhat gorgeous goal, the great grandmasters might naturally walk together. The bitterness in Fan Xian's mouth grew. If the situation continued to develop like this, how could there be anyone left alive on Dong Mountain? But could it be that the emperor did not predict this situation from the very beginning? He carefully glanced at the emperor's face and found that the emperor's expression was somewhat gloomy. In the night, his pupils were flashing with flames. He didn't continue thinking about these questions. He quickly analyzed the situation in front of him in his mind. The outcome of the battle at Dong Mountain was unknown. If it reached a stalemate, there would be problems in Jingdo. He had to bring the news that the emperor was still alive to Jingdo and the Empress Dowager's side. Even if the emperor died and he returned to Jingdo, he had to let the Empress Dowager believe that the emperor was still alive. Otherwise, given the judgment of a political figure like the Empress Dowager, once she learned of the emperor's death, she would certainly choose to have the Qin family protect the crown prince's ascension to the throne and stabilize the Qin court. The emperor was her son. If someone wanted to harm the emperor, the Empress Dowager would certainly not allow it. If the emperor's death became a certain reality, as the oldest member of the royal family, the Empress Dowager had to consider the continued existence of the entire royal family and the survival of the world. Regardless of whether it was for his own safety or the situation in Jingdo, Fan Xian knew that the emperor's arrangements were correct. He had to bring the emperor's personally written letter and royal seal back to Jingdo to stabilize the situation and deal with the post-Grandmaster era. In the post-Grandmaster era, regardless of who won or lost in the battle at Dong Mountain, there would certainly be 1 or 2 great grandmasters who would leave the stage of history. He nodded silently and said, "Please rest assured, Your Majesty. Nothing will happen to Jingdo." The emperor glanced at him deeply and said, "The road ahead will be difficult and dangerous. You must be careful." Fan Xian was slightly startled. Originally, in the depths of his heart, he had been full of mockery and self-mockery toward the emperor's earlier words, "I have 4 sons." Unexpectedly, after hearing these words, his heart softened slightly. Fastening his belt and confirming that he was fully equipped, Fan Xian quickly changed from an official to a 9th-level night walker. He restrained his aura from head to toe. It was as if he wanted to become one with the scenery at the summit of Dong Mountain. Only the infuriating silver moonlight shone unharmoniously on his body. He carried the emperor's royal seal and the letter to the Empress Dowager. They were not very heavy, but he felt very heavy. He knew that the news of Dong Mountain being surrounded would certainly return to Jingdo soon. At the same time, the news that would return would be that the emperor had been assassinated. The eldest princess had used the perfect time difference. She didn't even need to prepare anything in Jingdo. As long as she confirmed the emperor's death, the Empress Dowager would have to walk out sorrowfully from behind the curtain and choose one of the three princes to inherit the throne. At this time, the worship to heaven had not been completed. The heavenly edict had not descended. Although everyone under heaven knew that the crown prince was about to be deposed, the crown prince was still the crown prince. Regardless of whether one looked at it from the perspective of the stability of court politics or any other angle, the Empress Dowager would choose the crown prince to inherit the throne. This was not a conspiracy. It was just taking advantage of the situation. Even if the emperor had countless backup plans in Jingdo and Chen Pingping and the imperial army were equally loyal, once the news of the emperor's death spread through the world, who would openly disobey the Empress Dowager's edict, unless they wanted to rebel a second time. Fan Xian stretched his limbs as if he wanted to lighten the burden on his body. He knew that he was essentially carrying the Qing kingdom's dragon chair on his back. After all, they are your brothers. The emperor stood beside the black-clothed Fan Xian and coldly said. The emperor stood beside the black-clothed Fan Xian and coldly said, "If we can avoid killing, we won't, particularly Qingzi. If I have to, then I'll kill them all." Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly and he nodded. The corners of the emperor's lips twitched slightly. Gazing at the little boat in the distance, he mockingly said, "Why is Uncle Lu Yun so slow? As a great grandmaster, do you still have uncontrollable cowardice when facing me? Do you still need helpers?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. He raised his head to glance at the bright moon in the sky and furrowed his brows. "During the day, I once told you why I chose Dong Mountain to worship heaven," the emperor suddenly said. "The first reason was to invite Fifth Prince out of the mountain." Fan Xian looked at the emperor. The emperor gazed at him calmly and said, "The second reason is that Dong Mountain is a lonely peak by the sea. It is the best place to die." Yunrui had Yan Xiaoi surround the mountain, and then invited Uncle Lu Yun to come up and assassinate me. I have nowhere to go. Dong Mountain was isolated by the sea. There was only one dead end to the foot of the mountain. The side of the mountain facing the sea was a stone wall as smooth as jade. Even a great grandmaster would not be able to use lightness skills to ascend. If the emperor was assassinated there, it would truly be difficult for him to escape. I chose Dong Mountain as a place of death to give Yunrui a misconception. The emperor seemed to have shaken off the news that Sigujian might have come and recovered his confident expression. Calmly, he looked into Fan Xian's eyes as if he wanted to see through his heart. She thought she could seal off all news of Dong Mountain and let her do as she pleased in Jingdo. She forgot that I chose this place of death, because I have a living person by my side who can fly out of this place of death. Fan Xian smiled bitterly. He thought that even his ultimate skill had not escaped the emperor's eyes. It looked like there were not many things about him that the emperor didn't know. In this world, probably only his strange method of channeling qi could help him slide down the mirror-smooth Dong Mountain. The emperor had captured him and brought him to Dong Mountain to set up an ambush there. The emperor had indeed thought far into the future. Fan Xian's heart suddenly jumped. He was no longer as worried as before. Since the emperor could even use him, how could he not have a plan to deal with the most dangerous situation in front of him? The emperor smiled slightly and said, "I once told Gong Yan that your ability to climb walls is very similar to mine. Much better than mine." Fan Xian looked at the abyss-like cliff under his feet and twisted his neck. In a rare moment, he made a joke. "It's a pity that the moonlight tonight is too bright. The moon waxes and wanes. That's what you once said." The emperor raised his head to the sky and said, "I cannot predict everything that will happen, but I know that the moon cannot remain this bright forever." As his words fell, a layer of dark clouds floated in from the sky and hid the full moon behind them. The silver light suddenly disappeared. Night once again descended upon the land. The summit of Dong Mountain was completely dark. There was no trace of Fan Xian at the emperor's side. The dark forest at the foot of the mountain was filled with the smell of blood. It was even more fishy than the sea breeze. Occasionally, the moonlight would brush through the forest. It was faintly possible to see corpses everywhere in the forest. Some of the corpses were lying on the ground while others were leaning weakly against tree trunks. Most of the dead wore the uniform of the Imperial Army. What was more consistent was that these Imperial Army soldiers who had been killed had numerous arrows pierced through their bodies. The arrows pierced deep into the bodies of the dead and viciously pinned them to the trees and the ground. The scene appeared wretched and terrifying. The forest at the foot of Dong Mountain was dense. The road was covered by the darkness and the forest at the same time. It was impossible to see its general appearance. One could only see countless corpses and blood. The closer they got to the foot of the mountain, the more intense the battle earlier could be seen. Fires lit and then extinguished. Only a few trees in the forest near the mountain gate were still burning. They only lit up a corner of the silent night. The smell of burning on the ground gradually rose, suppressing the smell of blood and the sea breeze. It made the soldiers on both sides nervous. Whoosh! A sharp sound broke through the air. A long arrow shot out like lightning and hit an Imperial Army soldier closest to the edge of the forest. The Imperial Army soldier gripped the long arrow in his chest and wanted to pull it out. Under the intense pain, he no longer had the strength. Slowly, he sat down. Just as he was about to sit down, 3 more arrows pierced through the air and pierced into his body. The Imperial Army soldier's head tilted to the side. Blood sprayed from his lips as he died. It was completely silent at the foot of the mountain. The 5,000 rebel soldiers had come to Dong Mountain without anyone knowing and launched the most despicable and sudden night attack on the 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers. The Imperial Army was unable to react in time. Additionally, they had followed the royal entourage to worship heaven and had not prepared the heavy armor needed for battle in the field. The attacking rebel army was Yan Xiaoyi's personal camp. More than 5,000 longbowmen and marksmen had feigned an attack between Sangzhou and Yanjing. With Sigujian's tacit approval and purposeful concealment, they had passed through the 16 vassal states of Dongyi and emerged from a secret tunnel to the north of Danzhou. Using nearly 20 days, they had sealed off Dong Mountain like 5,000 ghosts. The scouts along Dong Mountain had all been killed by the aces of the rebel army. They didn't have time to send out any news. 2,000 Imperial Army soldiers without heavy armor had been ambushed by 5,000 longbowmen. One could imagine the heavy price they had to pay. What made these Imperial Army soldiers most angry and pained was that the first wave of attack from the rebel army archers was actually fire arrows. In that instant, it was as if thousands of sky lanterns had been lit at the foot of Dong Mountain. They floated toward the Imperial Army camp. The moment the fire arrows landed on the ground, they ignited. The camp began to burn. The forest began to burn. Everything began to burn. The power was ferocious. It was the spots of fire that the Qing Emperor and his group on the summit of the mountain saw. It was impossible for the Imperial Army to divert their attention to put out the fire. The burning fire and the suddenly bright night forest exposed all of their figures to the opposing archers. Although the Imperial Army was well trained and immediately found a suitable cover in the first instant, they still lost more than 200 lives in the rain of arrows that followed closely behind. What followed was a bloody and tedious counterattack, a surprise attack, failure, and annihilation. The ground was littered with bodies and the mountain was covered in fresh blood. In just a few rounds, the rebel army had defeated the Imperial Army and obtained an initial victory. They had sealed off the Imperial Army troops in an area half a li to the left of the mountain gate. The rebel army's attack suddenly stopped. There was only the occasional cold arrow that shot out and coldly killed the Imperial Army soldiers who had tried to break out of the encirclement to report. The occasional sound of an arrow made the suddenly deathly silent forest at the foot of the mountain even quieter. It was a deathly silence. Suddenly, a person covered in blood abruptly stood up from the pile of corpses. For such a scene to suddenly appear on such a moonlit night and in such a hellish field, the soldiers on both sides felt terror. However, they immediately grew numb. So many people had died. Who would be afraid of a corpse turning? The fingers of the archers Yan Xiaoyi had sent out trembled. 10 arrows shot out. The target of each arrow was not the same. They were aimed at a certain spot on the bloody man's body and enveloped his entire body. It was very mournful, making it impossible for the person to dodge. This was a military order. No one was allowed to break out of the encirclement. Thus, each time the attacking rebel army shot a person, they had to ensure that person died. Suddenly, someone walked out from the pile of corpses. The archers unconsciously released their arrows, thinking, "Are you still not dead?" However, no one expected that the bloody man did not care about the 10 soul-devouring arrows in front of him at all. He just casually picked up 2 corpses beside him and used them as shields. Poo, piu, piu, piu. A series of muffled sounds rang out. More than 10 arrows shot at the bloody man at almost the same time. However, in the next moment, it was clear that they had only shot at the bloody man's dancing corpse. Countless amounts of blood sprayed out, dyeing the bloody man even more horrifying. The corpse was heavier than the shield, yet this bloody man was able to dance the corpse and block the extremely fast arrows. It had to be said that this person's arm strength was very shocking. His vision and realm were even more stunning. Someone in the rebel army camp seemed to have given the order, so there were no arrows fired at the same time. The bloody man slowly put down the corpse in his hand. He grimaced as if he was sorrowful, sympathetic, and emotional about something. Then, he slowly walked in the direction of the mountain gate. Without the disturbance of the arrows, he walked very calmly. He walked to the foot of the mountain gate. A thunderous cheer came from the Imperial Army. They didn't know who this bloody man was, but they knew he was an official of the Overwatch Council and a trusted aide of Commissioner Fan. Furthermore, he was an absolute ace. In the rebel army's third wave of attacks, this Overwatch Council official killed 40 longbowmen alone until he was finally knocked down by the wave of people and buried in the pile of corpses. Everyone thought he was dead. Unexpectedly, he was still alive. On such a terrifying night, at a moment when the rebel army could shoot all of the Imperial Army to death at any moment, the sudden discovery of such a powerful figure on their side was enough to raise the morale of what was left of the Imperial Army. That was why there was that thunderous cheer. 13th Wang walked to the foot of the scorched mountain gate and slowly sat down on the stone step. Accepting a towel from a member of the Chinian unit beside him, he wiped the blood from his face, revealing his bright and handsome face. He grinned, revealing a mouthful of healthy white teeth. Gazing into the darkness at where the rebel army was, he smiled. 13th Wang was a true warrior. Tonight, he had learned to use a corpse to block arrows. He could no longer be considered a brute. If Fan Xian had seen this scene, he would certainly have sighed with regret. The sound of horse hooves could be heard. The rebel army parted, and a few horses came out. On the first horse sat a person. This person was shrouded in black from head to toe, and even his face was covered. Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers didn't know who this black-clothed man was. They only knew that Governor Yan had given strict orders that this battle was to be commanded by this person. Although the trusted soldiers strictly obeyed military orders, they were still dissatisfied in their hearts. It wasn't until they passed through the mountains and crossed the water to the foot of Dong Mountain that this black-clothed man gave out military orders to divide and surround the Imperial Army and beat them into a sorry state. They were all simple orders and direct arrangements. However, they exquisitely matched the terrain at the foot of Dong Mountain and the dark night environment. This black-clothed man's use of troops was truly godly. Reality proved everything. The gazes of the 5,000 longbowmen present as they looked at the black-clothed man were filled with respect and fear. Even the puzzling military order to withdraw earlier, no one dared to question it. The black-clothed man was tall. Sitting on the horse, he appeared even more mighty. It was a pity that he was shrouded in black clothing. No one could see his true face or the might hidden under the black clothing. The black-clothed man looked at the blood-covered young man with jade-white teeth at the foot of the mountain gate. A voice came out from the black cloth and sighed with emotion. "How brave! I've tried to kill him 3 times and still haven't killed him. He truly is a warrior. If this person joins the army in less than a year, the world will have another brave general." The black-clothed man suddenly smiled slightly. "However, the general trend has already been formed. How can the strength of one man go against the heavens? It is a pity that in a bit more time this warrior will die." Suddenly, someone beside him sighed. The black-clothed man turned his head and looked over. Warmly, he asked, "Does Master Yun value talent?" The person who sighed was none other than the first disciple of Dongyi Sigujien, a master swordsman of his generation, Yun Zhilan. Fan Xian had indeed guessed correctly. Dongyi had indeed sent out their most elite group of assassins to help the eldest princess rebel army. Furthermore, it was Yun Zhilan who was personally leading the group. Yun Zhilan glanced at the black-clothed man beside him and forced a smile. However, he did not reply to this question. Because among all the people present, only he knew who the young man who was covered in blood and yet still maintained a smile was. That person was not an official of the Overwatch Council. He was not even a citizen of the Qin Kingdom. He was 13th Wang, his teacher's most beloved disciple and his most accomplished younger brother disciple. Have they all gone crazy? Yun Zhilan muttered to himself. He thought to himself, since my brother disciple knows that the sect has sent people, why is he still standing guard at the mountain gate like a fierce tiger? What exactly is he thinking? Teacher sent you to follow Fan Xian, but he didn't want you to truly become Fan Xian's helper. Yun Zhilan looked at the bloody man at the foot of the mountain gate in the distance, and thought with great confusion. To be loyal to one thing after doing something? To even disregard the interests of the sect? Is this madness, or is it the open killing nature that teacher admires the most? If one does not go crazy, how can one survive? The black-clothed man lightly replied to Yun Zhilan's sigh. Yun Zhilan shook his head and didn't say anything. Although he didn't know why his younger brother disciple would do this, as the heir of the sword hut, he respected his younger brother disciple. Thus, he would not reveal his younger brother disciple's background in front of this black-clothed man. He didn't know who this black-clothed man was, but all of the troops were led by him. Furthermore, after watching from the side for a long time, he had to admit that this black-clothed man's use of troops was indeed remarkable. He did not take any risks or clever trick. He fought steadily step by step and managed to deploy the resources of the entire rebel army to a near-perfect realm. He did not give the Qing Imperial Army any chance to counterattack or break out of the encirclement. Yun Zhilan brought out most of the aces of the sword hut to cooperate with Yan Xiaoyi's trusted soldiers. The cooperation between the two sides had always been problematic. If the swordsmen of the 6th Bureau of the Overwatch Council on the mountain or the highly skilled Tiger Guards had broken out, it would not have been so easy to completely seal them off. However, the black-clothed man on the horse seemed to have a pair of godly eyes that could see all the details on the battlefield. At the beginning of the surprise attack, he forcefully ordered the aces of Dongyi to go to seemingly unassuming places to set up ambushes. At the beginning, Yun Zhilan didn't understand. As the repeated attacks happened in the darkness and the repeated attempts to break out of the encirclement on Dong Mountain were ruthlessly pressed down by the black-clothed man's wrist, Yun Zhilan finally understood. This black-clothed man was no ordinary person. He was able to command the entire battlefield and not let go of any possible openings. Such a use of troops could not be achieved without decades of experience on the battlefield. Thus, Yun Zhilan was confused as to why Yan Xiaoyi had not personally led the troops here. Who exactly was this black-clothed man? He was guessing. Many people in the rebel army were guessing the black-clothed man's identity. This black-clothed man had only brought 2 trusted soldiers into the rebel army. He was free and at ease, but he used troops like he was moving his fingers. He was free and decisive in killing. He was worthy of admiration. The black-clothed man did not explain to his subordinates why he had stopped attacking. He only looked coldly at the suddenly rising mountain in front of him. Leading the rebel army to attack this time was only a part of the agreement. If he didn't temporarily hold this power in his own hands, it would be difficult for the emperor to make that decision. Suddenly, a black cloud floated across the sky and completely covered the bright moon. The area near the mountain gate was covered in darkness. The black-clothed man sat motionless on the horse. Only the short weapons in the cloth bags held by his 2 trusted subordinates beside him flickered with a faint light. Fan Xian didn't know how long this cloud would cover the moon. He silently slid down the mountain. He didn't slow or speed up. Terrifyingly, he maintained a steady speed. During the day, the jade-like wall facing the Sea of Dong Mountain gave off a faint and deep light in the night. It merged perfectly with him, who was wearing black clothing. The knife-like dividing line along the 2 sides of Dong Mountain pierced straight into the ground by the sea. There were aces from Dongyi lying in ambush there, so he could not choose that route. He could only descend from the side facing the sea breeze. No one in this world could slide down from such a hopeless situation other than Fan Xian. Thus, he was not worried that the people on the sea or the rebel soldiers on land would discover his tracks. He was still incomparably nervous because he always felt a pair of eyes behind him piercing through the night and the whistling sea breeze and calmly watching him. Chapter 527. No one was looking at him. Fan Xian knew this was an illusion. Just like the last time he was outside Shangjing in northern Qi, on the precipice of Qi Mountain, he always felt that there was a pair of eyes watching him from the forest behind him. This was probably the stress reaction of a person facing a difficult and hopeless situation and experiencing emotional shock, particularly the natural reaction of an idealist like Fan Xian. A year ago, when he had sat on the white sailboat to return to Danzhou to visit relatives, he had passed by this great Dong Mountain that seemed to have been cleaved in half by a god's sword. At the time, he had looked at the smooth jade walls of Dong Mountain and had thought self-mockingly that he would not one day have to climb this mountain, right? Unexpectedly, all of this had become reality. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, there was the firmament above. Had heaven truly been watching him this entire time? The great Dong Mountain was more dangerous, slippery, and higher than the precipice of Qi Mountain. When Fan Xian reached this place, his body had already begun to tremble. The exhaustion of his internal strength had already begun to affect his body. Like a bat, he gently stuck to the stone wall. His fingers dug into a rare crack and rested for a moment. Raising his head, he could no longer see the lights at the top of the mountain. Glancing back, he could see the increasingly ink-like seawater and a few military ships floating in the water. It was the Jiaozhou Navy ships. They were here to protect. Although they would not be of much use against the sudden attack by the rebel army, it was clear that they could sail away from this place and inform the local government. However, from the development of the situation until now, the Navy ships had not moved. Although Fan Xian had never discussed this matter with the emperor, the 2 of them knew that the Qin family had also encountered problems. A corner of the moon came out, but Fan Xian did not move in a panic. He pressed his face against the icy stone wall and felt the threads of cold air. He thought of a problem. If the Qin family was also counted, all of this was the gathering of all the power in the world to participate in the Dong Mountain operation. No wonder the emperor had not expected it. One person could make all the enemies in the world put aside their temporary differences and closely unite. What kind of realm was this? This was the realm of the Qing emperor. Although Northern Qi had not acted, it was clear that the eldest princess and Shang Shanhu had secretly made arrangements for Yan Xiaoyi's 5,000 trusted soldiers to come to the foot of Dong Mountain. Fan Xian rubbed his face against the cold stone. Would Haidang know about such an important matter? Immediately, he breathed gently a few times. In reality, this dangerous situation, no matter how he looked at it, was created by Chen Pingping, the old cripple, using many years of time. He had also participated a few times. Whether it was the eldest princess, the Qin family, or the Yi family, they were all driven to the opposite side of the emperor by him and the old cripple with great care. If Chen Pingping knew that things would develop in this way, would he feel that things in the world were really wonderful, just like how he felt when he was on the cliff? The wind on the cliff was very strong. The suction force between his hand and the smooth stone surface was very strong. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body gently opened and closed along his thick meridians to prevent his internal energy from running out. The gentle and natural aura of Tianyi Dao was slowly repairing the instability in his meridians. He swallowed and used the faint moonlight to look at the perfectly straight lines of the rock above his head. He couldn't help but feel some lingering fear. If he couldn't stick to the stone wall and fell like this into the sea full of reefs and dangerous waves, he would probably be smashed to pieces. The wind on this cliff facing the sea was too strong. It poured in through his 4 limbs and was icy cold. He was not Wu Zhu. He didn't have the miraculous martial method to descend from the sky, so he stuck closer to the wall. How did the emperor know Uncle Wu Zhu was on Dong Mountain? A question that he had never had a chance to ask rose in Fan Xian's mind. It looked like the emperor probably had some secret connection to the temple. However, the great priest's strange death last year. These things were a bit hard to explain. The clouds once again covered the moon. Fan Xian began to move down the cliff again. He didn't know how long he had been sliding. He got closer and closer to the basin of ink-like seawater. He also became more and more cautious. He raised his martial power to its peak, ready to welcome unknown danger at any moment. The closer he was to the sea, the easier it was for the rebel soldiers on the Navy ships to discover him. The closer he was to the sea, the closer he was to the little boat on the sea. The rebel soldiers on the Navy ships might not be able to clearly see the little dot slowly crawling on the cliff in the darkness, but Yi Lu Yun might be able to discover him. His palms pressed tightly against the smooth cliff. Suddenly, his pupils constricted. He felt a sharp killing intent behind him. Who could have such eyesight to discover him? Fan Xian had no time to think. Unconsciously, he forcefully severed the Jinqi flowing through his body. The connection between his palms and the stone wall suddenly lost its effectiveness. His entire body slid down. Thud! A black and faint arrow struck where he had been hiding. The metal tip pierced deeply into the stone wall of Dong Mountain and sent out dozens of pieces of rock. If Fan Xian's reaction had been slightly slower, he would have been nailed to the stone wall by this arrow. And at this moment, he was still in danger. His entire body smoothly swept down the stone wall at high speed. Fan Xian gave a muffled grunt. The Jinqi flow that had just been severed was forcefully pushed to the limit again. His palms gently slapped against the stone wall and barely managed to stabilize his body. Whoosh! The second black arrow shot ruthlessly into the stone wall under his feet. It was only half an inch away from his heel. The situation was extremely dangerous. The person who had fired the arrow had clearly planned ahead and calculated the speed of Fan Xian's fall. If Fan Xian had planned to naturally fall and avoid the sudden attack of the arrow, it would have been difficult for him to escape. Cold sweat poured down Fan Xian's back. With a shake of his right palm, half of his body left the wall and drew a semicircle in the air before sticking back to the stone wall. However, now that he was facing the ocean, he had no time to think. Purely unconsciously, he slid down the stone wall by 3 feet. Immediately after, His right palm slapped down again. His body bent strangely and twisted downwards. From a ship on the ocean, a dozen black arrows shot toward him coldly and mercilessly. They brushed past his body, pierced through his clothes, and stabbed ruthlessly into the stone wall. Thud! 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 Fan Xian stubbornly and dangerously dodged on the stone wall. Purely relying on the never-ending training in his 20 years of rebirth and the foundation Wu Zhu had laid down as a child, he unconsciously dodged these unpredictable arrows. The situation was very dangerous. The black arrows came in a continuous stream and didn't give him any time to react. Furthermore, they seemed to have calculated his next landing spot clearly, forcing him to the point where he could fall off the cliff at any moment. Strangely, each time it seemed that Fan Xian would be hit by the black arrows, he would make a prediction. The zhenqi in his body circulated vigorously through 2 circulations, replenishing the zhenqi he had lost. It allowed him to barely ensure that one of his 2 palms would always stay on the stone wall. Each time it looked like he was about to fall, the palm stuck to the stone wall would pull him, twisting his body as he bounced up and down. It was as if he would never be able to escape the pull of the stone wall. He was like a wooden puppet made of black material. His 4 limbs were pulled by the mysterious power in the stone wall of Dong Mountain as he performed a stiff and comical dance on the cliff. The black arrows that followed closely behind his body valiantly brushed past his body and shot into the stone wall. They formed a few messy lines on the stone wall. The front of the lines chased after him with a strong murderous aura. At any moment they could pin this wooden puppet to death and shoot through his heart. Because the Navy ships were worried about the hidden reefs at the foot of Dong Mountain, they didn't get too close. To be able to shoot an arrow into the stone wall from so far away, there was only one person in the world. Only that person could discover Fan Xian hiding on the stone wall in such a dark night. The Qing army's northern governor, Yan Xiaoi. After an indeterminable amount of time, the black arrows on the ocean's surface stopped. There was no trace of Fan Xian on the cliff. The bottom of the cliff returned to silence. There was only the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Fan Xian had finally successfully dodged the chain of arrows and landed on the rock. Stab! The last black arrow also seemed to have missed. It stabbed ruthlessly into the stone wall, sinking more than an inch into the stone. The tail of the arrow trembled endlessly and made a buzzing sound. There were a few strands of black cloth on the shaft. The sound of the waves on the rocks shook the sky. Fan Xian half knelt on the slippery rocks and began to cough uncontrollably. Fortunately, the Navy ships were too far away. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was too loud. It covered up his series of cough. In the dark night, he did not reveal his figure. His face was pale. Climbing down this kind of precipice where humans couldn't walk, and then avoiding Yan Xiaoi's marvelous chain of fatal arrows, he had already used up too much of his zhenqi and spirit. The last part of the puppet dance on the cliff seemed to have been easily dodged, but it was already a display of his highest realm. Every second, every moment, his nerves were tense. He had dodged the impossible. The speed at which the zhenqi in his body changed was too fast and the frequency was too high. Even with the powerful width of his meridians, he still could not withstand it. When the zhenqi reversed, it injured a meridian below his diaphragm. It made him cough and feel a tearing pain in his chest. Compared to this, he did not care too much about the wretched wound on his right shoulder. Although the wound had been twisted by the sharp arrow until the flesh had split open and blood flowed freely, even the black Overwatch Council official's robe had been torn and mixed into the wound. It was very painful, but it had not injured any vital parts. It was nighttime, which was disadvantageous to Yan Xiaoi. However, Fan Xian was on the precipice and was at an even greater disadvantage. Thus, this attack and escape were not fair. No matter how valiant Fan Xian was, in the end, he had not dodged the last arrow. However, How many people could keep their lives from Yan Xiaoyi's chain of arrows under such dangerous conditions? Fan Xian lowered his body very low. The seawater soaked through his clothes, making the black clothes soak with water. It blended perfectly with the reef that was often submerged in the seawater. Fan Xian was not worried about whether or not Yan Xiaoyi's arrow had been coated with poison. For one, he knew that Yan Xiaoyi was proud and arrogant and had always disdained the use of poison. For another, he took out a pill from his clothes and chewed it, mixing it with his saliva and swallowed it. In terms of using poison, not many people were better than him. The situation on the shoreline was still tense. The ship could not get close to the precipice. Presumably, the eagle-like eyes on the ship were staring at all the movements below the precipice. They had to kill Fan Xian before he came ashore. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and observed his surroundings. The moon in the sky was not bright, but the waves were growing larger and larger. On one hand, it protected him. On the other, it made it difficult for him to find a safe path. If he were to use his lightness kung fu to fly from the reef, it would be giving Yan Xiaoyi another opportunity to kill him. Fan Xian did not like the feeling of being targeted by an arrow and unable to retaliate, particularly being targeted by Yan Xiaoyi's arrow. Suddenly, a warning flashed in his mind. With a muffled groan, his right palm slapped the reef beside him. Tyrannical true energy surged out violently, and an extremely violent force smashed a corner of the reef below him. His body also followed the strong reaction force, drawing a slanted arc, and using the fastest speed possible, he fell into the sea. The moment the splash appeared, it was immediately swallowed up by the growing waves. The white spray at the bottom of the precipice seemed to be incomparably angry that someone dared to underestimate its power and throw himself into the sea full of submerged reef. This time, Fan Xian revealed his tracks. Although he had sunk into the sea, he could not escape the pursuit of the eagle-like eyes. However, he had to jump into the sea. He had to use the fastest speed and most decisive stance to leave the reef that temporarily protected his safety. Even if the sea was angry, he still had to throw himself into it. He would rather face the angry sea and be targeted to death by Yan Xiaoyi's arrow in the sea than stand on the reef and face the trembling in his heart. A line swept over from the sea. It was a white line. The waves were so large, but the white line seemed to have a power beyond the world. It was not disturbed by the spray. On the contrary, it quietly and clearly drew toward the bottom of the precipice of Dong Mountain. It was like a god's hand holding a magical pen and drawing a line in the angry ink-like ocean water. The white line was actually a wave that had broken through the water. An ancient sword was swiftly sweeping 2 feet above the line. The moment Fan Xian flipped his body away from the reef, the white line was about to touch the reef. The ancient sword and his body met in a flash and then separated. No one knew if they had touched or not. The reef was thrown into chaos. Before the power of the sword arrived, the sword intent seeped out and easily split open the wet black reef where Fan Xian had landed earlier. In front of this sword, the reef was like black tofu. Then, the sword swept through the waves and air and pierced into the smooth stone wall of Dong Mountain. The stone wall was very hard, but the body of the sword had completely pierced in. Only the hilt was left like a small dot. Chapter 528. There was seawater in all directions. It was as heavy as a giant rock pressing down on him. The ink-like seawater poured into his mouth, nose, and ears, making it impossible for him to breathe. His body swayed endlessly with the undercurrent. He looked like a fish that had been knocked unconscious. At any moment, he could be swept up by the undercurrent and smashed into the submerged reef. Suddenly, Fan Xian opened his eyes. His pupils were calm. His cheeks gradually puffed up. Using the pressure of the qi in his body and the pressure of the seawater outside, he barely managed to achieve a balance. His right hand stretched out and created a line in the seawater. Suddenly, he grabbed the corner of a reef at the bottom of the sea and stabilized his body at the bottom of the sea. He was a full 40 feet from the surface of the water. Earlier, the sword from outer space had not pierced his body, but the sword intent had already attacked his heart meridian and caused him internal injuries. This internal injury was even more terrifying than Yan Xiaoyi's arrow earlier. The tyrannical Jinqi in Fan Xian's body moved quickly, resisting the power of nature. Tianyi Dao's Jinqi moved gently along the circulation in his body, slowly smoothing out the injuries caused by Yi Liuyun's heaven-shaking strike. Deep at the bottom of the sea, there was no way to immediately heal it. However, it could at least suppress the injury for a while. However, the two different types of Jinqi in his body were moving at high speed, bringing a great burden to his body. A wave of power was expanding inside his body. Gradually, 2 streams of blood flowed out from his nostrils. Disturbed by the undercurrent of the sea, the blood quickly dispersed into a cloud of blood mist, covering his face. The arrow wound on his shoulder also began to bleed rapidly. His entire body was like a leather bag filled with red paint. Someone had pricked 2 small holes. It looked very terrifying. Fan Xian's cheeks puffed up, and his eyes were wide open. His face had already changed shape. With one hand clawing at the submerged reef, he looked at the surface of the sea like a toad. The problem was, this toad was bleeding and would die at any moment. Thus, he could not laugh, nor was he in the mood to laugh. Thinking of the dangerous scene earlier, he couldn't help but feel a chill in his heart. The seawater scattered his hair, making it float around like seaweed. Amidst the seaweed, a complicated emotion flashed through the pupils on his deathly pale face. On the surface of the sea, Yan Xiaoyi's arrow was still waiting for him. He could not immediately float to the surface of the sea. As for the great Grandmaster breaking through the waves on a boat, presumably, he would have no interest in attacking him again after his attack had failed. He didn't know how long he had been in the sea. The skin of his hand, which was gripping the submerged reef, already had a strange feeling. But he stared wide at the surface of the sea. He had no way to escape. At this moment, he finally felt a trace of regret. Yesterday, he should have brought that box with him. If he had that box by his side, he wouldn't have been suppressed by Yan Xiaoyi's arrows. Speaking of which, this only proved that the person Fan Xian was most wary of after his rebirth was still the Qing Emperor. Perhaps this was a shadow left over from history, or perhaps it was just a subconscious part of his intuition. However, he did not want to reveal his trump card in front of the Emperor. He as he could. As he was, as he with the Emperor as. And as he as he and an end to he. He didn't know the Emperor's trump card. He didn't know how the Emperor would react once he knew he had a weapon that could kill gods and monarchs in this world. This kind of thinking affected Fan Xian's decision, which was why he had sunk into his current dangerous situation. Fortunately, he had not died to those arrows and swords. He should be proud of this. If the story of the dance at the bottom of the cliff, the black arrow, and the sword breaking through the waves spread throughout the world, presumably, everyone's understanding of Fan Xian would enter a whole new level. A great Grandmaster and the world's most powerful 9th-level ace had not been able to kill Fan Xian. It was enough to make him proud. The tyrannical Jinqi in his body valiantly provided the nutrients his body needed. Without being able to breathe air, he would not be able to hold out for long. Fan Xian's nose and mouth were no longer bleeding. The wound on his shoulder had been soaked in the seawater until it had turned white. Like the stomach of a dead fish, it was no longer bleeding. A glimmer of determination flashed across his pale face. His right hand moved down again and picked up a large rock from the sand at the bottom of the sea. He didn't dare to float up for now, so he chose a stupid method he had learned from watching Huiyuanjia in his previous life. However, back then, Huiyuanjia had walked on the bottom of the river. Right now, he was walking on the bottom of the sea. Hugging the large rock, he used its weight to stabilize his body. Under the impact of the undercurrent at the bottom of the sea, he did not sway. Fan Xian stepped forcefully on the sand and advanced. He did not try to break out of the encirclement by following the shoreline. There were aces blocking the two sides of Dong Mountain. He couldn't guarantee that his remaining Jinchi could support him on the bottom of the sea for long, so he chose the closest path to the surface of the sea. He walked to the bottom of the Jiaozhou Navy's ship. Raising his head, he opened his eyes and calmly glanced at the bottom of the ship, which was darker than the color of the seawater. A powerful desire to escape made his sixth senses incomparably sharp. He could even clearly see the moss and shells at the bottom of the wooden ship. He put down the heavy rock in his arms. The rock landed on the bottom of the sea and didn't make much noise. It only shook up some sand. His hands slowly drew two semicircles and carried out one last adjustment. Fan Xian relaxed his body and followed the buoyancy of the sea to float upward as naturally as possible. He was terrified of startling Governor Yen, whose eyes were like an eagle's, ears like a shark's, and nose like a dog's. Maintaining the feeling of a piece of driftwood, Fan Xian slowly floated to the bottom of the military ship. Very carefully, he moved toward the outer edge of the bottom of the ship. He still didn't poke his head out of the water. Separated by about half a foot of seawater, he did his best to watch the movement on this side of the ship. This was a gamble. The reason he had chosen this ship was because Yen Xiaoi had not fired the arrow from this ship earlier. If the helper he was looking for was not on this ship, Fan Xian could only dive down again and search for an opportunity on another ship. He didn't know if he would be able to make it to the other ship. Fortunately, his luck this time was not bad. A strange smile rose to Fan Xian's pale face soaking in the seawater. He thought to himself that his luck in this life was indeed incomparable to that of others. He saw a hand on the side of the ship. The hand was very naturally resting on the side of the ship. It was gently making noiseless knocks, maintaining a steady and strange frequency. On the surface of the sea, there were 5 Navy ships slowly cruising. Under the illumination of the moonlight, these ships were like demons searching for prey, slicing through the surface of the water, ready at any moment to nail the prey hidden at the bottom of the sea. Another 3 ships sailed far away from the main group, maintaining a corresponding distance. They were responsible for providing support and keeping a wider watch. On one of the ships, the lights in the middle of the hall were dim. The Jiaozhou Navy general in charge of this ship, Su Maokai, was sitting coldly in an armchair. Of his 3 trusted soldiers, 2 were responsible for guarding outside the hall. 1 was responsible for communicating with the Navy's flagship. There was only 1 trusted soldier left by his side. The soldier's face was hidden in the darkness behind the light. His facial features could not be seen clearly, but it could faintly be seen that his face was slightly pale. No one knew if he had been frightened by the battle array tonight. It was completely silent on the ship. Suddenly, the trusted soldier opened his mouth to speak. Why did the Jiaozhou Navy also betray? Su Maokai was now the 3rd-ranked figure in the Jiaozhou Navy. He had enough power under his command. For a major matter like tonight, if he didn't know the inside story, he would not have followed the Navy's flagship to surround the sea around Dong Mountain. He lowered his head and then slowly said, "Young master, the situation right now is not that the Jiaozhou Navy has betrayed. Rather, it is you who has betrayed?" The trusted soldier was Fan Xian, whose luck was so good that he had quietly snuck onto the ship. Su Maokai was an old member of the Quanzhou Navy. Furthermore, the hand that had been hanging outside the ship proved that he had been secretly hoping that Fan Xian would be able to escape from death. Thus, Fan Xian had enough trust in him. After hearing these words, Fan Xian still furrowed his brows. Fan Xian and the Emperor had long guessed what the eldest princess would do. For such a major matter as the Dong Mountain attack, They could at most control the news for a few days. In the end, the emperor would be assassinated and the crown prince would succeed. The matter of the emperor being assassinated needed someone to take the blame. That person had to have enough power to kill the emperor and have the motive to do so. Only then would they be able to convince the Empress Dowager in the palace and the officials in court. Even if it wasn't to convince, they had to give those people a psychological explanation. It was clear that among the group of people heading to Dong Mountain to worship heaven, the only person who had the power to kill the emperor was the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian, who held 500 Black Knights and had a few unknown aces in secret. As for the motive to assassinate the emperor, presumably, given the eldest princess' intelligence, she would circle around the matter of the old Yi family that the Empress Dowager was most wary of. You didn't respond. I trust that you also didn't send a message to Wu Gafei. You also didn't send a message to Ho Jichang. Fan Xian stood behind Su Maokai and stared coldly at the side of his face. In order to prevent someone from suddenly entering the room, he had only slightly bandaged his wound at the back of the ship and disguised himself as Su Maocai's trusted soldier, standing behind him the entire time. I had you stay with the Jiaozhou Navy for this day. Fan Xian's tone was calm, but there was a glimmer of anger in it. In the end, you didn't do anything. The Overwatch Council assassinating the emperor may have convinced some of the generals in the navy, but how could you believe it? Furthermore, why was Yan Xiaoyi on the navy ship? Did these navy generals not have questions in their hearts? Why would they believe in your loyalty and have you come to Dong Mountain? Su Maokai lowered his head and thought for a moment. He then said, as for the matter of assassinating the emperor, there should be some people who would believe it. After all, the Overwatch Council's reputation is not good. Furthermore, we received news yesterday that 500 Black Knights had traveled overnight from the Jiangbei camp to Shao Mountain. There was suddenly no news of them in the East Shandong Road area. Thus, it makes sense to say that these 500 Black Knights had come to assassinate the emperor. Fan Xian's heart trembled slightly. He had moved the 500 Black Knights here. However, they hadn't gotten close to the area of Dong Mountain. If the Jingdo people came here again and the emperor was truly unable to escape disaster, it would be difficult for him to explain. Fortunately, he still had a few trump cards. Su Maokai once again described the current military situation in detail. The more Fan Xian listened, the more helpless he felt. He had been at the top of the mountain for a day and half a night. Apparently, the rumors at the foot of the mountain had become completely different. Had he colluded with Dongyi's Sigujian to assassinate the emperor? Damn it! This kind of method of investigating the evidence is too childish. However, Fan Xian knew that methods were always secondary. As long as victory and defeat were decided by strength, no matter how childish the eldest princess's investigation was, it would become an ironclad fact in the history books. Of course, most people in the Navy have doubts. I even believe that some people know the truth of the Dong Mountain matter, Su Maokai said coldly. Even if they know the truth, so what? If it was still Chang Kuan leading the army in the past, given his and the old Navy generals' respect for the emperor, they would certainly not participate in this matter even if they were beaten to death. Young master, you went on a killing spree in Jiaozhou last year. Many of the old generals have already been killed. Who knows how many generals have begun to feel cold toward the court? Presently, the Jiaozhou Navy is already the world of the Qin family. Even if it was truly a rebellion, I believe the generals on the Navy ships at the foot of Dong Mountain would be very willing. Fan Xian calmly said, you should also know the truth. I have never doubted the changes in the Navy. The Emperor also knows about the Qin family. I believe he will certainly have follow-up plans. Thus, I am still curious as to how you obtained the eldest princess's trust. He suddenly furrowed his brows and said, their hearts are cold toward the court. Presumably, you have contributed to this matter. Maokai, I had you stay in the Jiaozhou Navy, not to have you create a rebel army. Su Maokai was silent for a moment. He then suddenly rose and bowed deeply toward Fan Xian. Sincerely, he said, young master, I am not talented. I have never been able to completely control the Jiaozhou navy in my hand. Since the eldest princess has rebelled and the Qin family has also joined in, you should have seen it. There is still that great grandmaster on the sea. This is a rare opportunity. His eyes stared at Fan Xian's pale face. A glimmer of loyalty and passion flashed through them. Gritting his teeth, he said, young master, take the opportunity to rebel. Fan Xian stared into Su Maocai's eyes and didn't speak for a long time. He knew this general's loyalty toward him, no, toward his mother. It wasn't that he hadn't guessed why he would bring up such a rebellious suggestion. He only gently shook his head. Why? Su Maokai lowered his voice and said anxiously, presently, all the truly powerful people in the world have been attracted to the Great Dong Mountain. Jingdo is just an empty stomach. Young master, take the opportunity to go ashore and contact the 500 Black Knights in the Shao Mountain area. Travel 1,000 li to attack Jingdo and coordinate with Director Chen from the inside and outside. In one move, you can control the royal palace. Once both sides have suffered heavy losses at Dong Mountain, you can, as a prince, climb high in Jingdo and raise your arms. Everything will be done. Fan Xian did his best to calm his tone to avoid hurting the heart of the person in front of him. Warmly, he said, the emperor is very guarded against me and has never let me command the army. How could a mere 500 Black Knights enter Jingdo? There are 10,000 Jingdo garrison outside Jingdo, 13 city gate guards in Jingdo, and 3,000 imperial soldiers. How could I deal with them? The commander of the Jingdo garrison is the Great Prince's trusted aide. The imperial army is completely under the Great Prince's control. The 13 city gate guards are directly under the emperor's command. Once the emperor is not present, they are headless people. It was clear that Su Maokai was prepared. Methodically, he spoke one thing at a time. Young master, since you have taken the risk to break through, you must have a keepsake from the emperor on you. It should be a personally written letter or jade seal. You can enter the palace alone, convince the Empress Dowager, and obtain Yi Guiping's support. Outside the palace, ask Director Chen to take action and sweep away the Crown Prince and Second Prince's power in one move. Fan Xian waved his hand and cut him off. All of this is built on the premise that the Great Prince supports me. Su Maokai didn't wait for him to finish and admonished, if the emperor dies, you also have the jade seal and imperial letters in your hands. You are also close friends with the Great Prince. If the Great Prince doesn't support you, who will he support? What about the Qin family? Fan Xian stared into his eyes and said each word clearly. And what about the Yi family in Dingzhou? How many soldiers do the two sides have combined? The Yi family has run the Jingdo garrison for 20 years. The Great Prince is unable to completely control them. So what? Su Maokai lowered his voice. There are 7 roads of elite soldiers in the Qin kingdom. Yan Xiaoi is in Dong Mountain and cannot move the northern expedition camp. The Yi and Qin families only have 2 subordinate. There are still 4 roads of elite soldiers. As long as you can control the palace, these 4 roads of elite soldiers will all be in your hands. Even if Jingdo is in danger at the beginning, in less than half a month, the entire situation can be reversed. The reason you hesitate is because you have never carefully analyzed just how much power you can mobilize in your hands. Su Maokai stared into Fan Xian's eyes and said each word clearly. The emperor was attacked by assassins in Dong Mountain. You have the jade seal and the emperor's personally written letter as proof. The crime of assassinating the emperor can easily be placed on the heads of the eldest princess, crown prince, and second prince. This is a righteous reason. In less than half a month, this righteous reason will receive the approval of the 4 roads of elite soldiers. Although you have no one in court, Prime Minister Lin has probably left a number of people for you. As for the beginning of the major event, the situation in Jingdo will be turbulent. However, Director Chen is the best at this kind of thing. Also, don't forget Minister Fan. He will certainly support you. Fan Xian was silent for a long time. He admitted that for the sake of the rebellion, Su Maokai had secretly put in a lot of effort and schemed for him for a long time. If the situation continued to develop like this, if he could leave the sea, escape Yan Xiaoi's pursuit, and return to Jingdo, perhaps the power of the Qin kingdom would truly be incomparably close to his hands. Was this kind of temptation great? Fan Xian didn't know because his state of mind was clear. He had not thought in that direction at all. Chapter 529. The sea wind whistled past the ship. The waves pushed the ship up and down. Although the lampstand attached to the wall of the ship would not fall to the ground, the flames in the lantern were sometimes large and sometimes small. The light made the expressions of the two people in the cabin uncertain. There was the faint sound of a message outside. A soldier knocked on the door and entered to report something to Su Maokai. He then hurriedly left the cabin. Tonight, the people within a radius of 20 li around Dong Mountain had sunk into a tense and fearful atmosphere. Regardless of whether they knew the truth or not, they were all terrified and uneasy. "We need to expand the search area," Su Maokai said in a low voice. His expression was complicated. Fan Xian's words earlier had directly overturned all of his thoughts. If the emperor had not died, Su Maokai did not believe Fan Xian's deduction. Although he didn't know the eldest princess's entire plan, looking at the situation at hand, how could the emperor have survived from the summit of Dong Mountain? As he was thinking, Fan Xian stood to the side and watched him quietly. It was clear that Su Maokai had played an important role in the Jiaozhou Navy's rebellion. Otherwise, the eldest princess's side would not have been at ease in allowing him to bring a ship here. Fan Xian knew that Su Maokai had never had any loyalty to the Qin court. He only had hatred and a desire for revenge. This so-called rebellion was something that happened naturally. However, the person he wanted to help in his rebellion was Fan Xian himself. That was why Su Maokai had not followed Fan Xian's plan and immediately made contact with the Jiaozhou Zhizhou Wu Gufei or Ho Jicheng. He had not sent the news of the Jiaozhou Navy's strange movements to the Overwatch Council, thus creating the difficult situation of Dong Mountain being surrounded. This was a chess piece Fan Xian had buried deeply in the Jiaozhou Navy. Because the chess piece had its own thoughts, it had lost its original use. Fan Xian could not get angry. Even his anger was faint because he knew this person's heart. Su Maokai saw that he was unable to convince Fan Xian. The expression on his face dimmed. A moment later, he said, "My original plan was to, at the last moment, move my subordinates to launch a counterattack on the sea, disrupt the Navy's encirclement, forcefully go ashore, and receive you down the mountain before heading to Jingdo." Fan Xian's heart trembled. Given the few ships in Su Maocai's hands and the strength of over 1,000 soldiers, he wanted to go ashore to receive him down the mountain. Presumably, he had the determination and courage to die. Who would have thought that you would actually be able to? Su Maokai shook his head and sighed. A glimmer of respect rose uncontrollably in his eyes. In the eyes of these people, a person who could escape from the precipice of Dong Mountain, which was as smooth as jade, seemed to have already left the realm of mortals. Su Maokai continued, "Your guess is correct. This time, the Jiaozhou Navy has joined the eldest princess plan. One reason is because of the Qin family, but the more important reason is because of my participation. If I let you meet with danger on the mountain, then I would not be able to make up for it even if I died 10,000 times. Fortunately, because of this, Governor Yen trusts me very much. Presumably, he won't be able to find this ship. You can rest assured and stay here." Fan Xian coughed and shook his head. I have to get back to Jingdo. After boarding the ship, the first thing he did was ask Su Maokai about the situation of the blockade on land and sea. He knew that the blockade tonight had gathered countless powerful people. In addition, there were terrifying 9th-level assassins from Dongyi. If he wanted to break through the blockade on land, it would be very difficult. Can you have the ship go 3 li north? He furrowed his brows. Beyond 3 li, those people won't be able to control a wider area. We should be able to find an opportunity. There are too many eyes watching. I have to wait. Su Maokai glanced at him worriedly and sighed. In his opinion, returning to the capital was not the most important thing right now. Finding a way to contact the Black Knights, and then get in touch with the people in Jingdo to sit on the mountain and watch the tigers fight was the wisest choice. How could Fan Xian not know that if he wanted to obtain the greatest benefit, it would be the best move if he could escape back to Jiangnan, notify Xueqing, and then return to the capital from Wuzhou to wait for backup. However, this kind of decision was, without question, not something a normal person could make. There were too many people in Jingdo that he needed to care about. The survival of the Qin kingdom, and whether or not war would break out. As Fan Xian's position, he had to keep these things in mind. I can't wait too long, Fan Xian said straightforwardly in a low voice. Fan Xian lowered his voice and spoke straightforwardly. The flame in the lamp rose and fell with the waves outside the cabin. It added a glimmer of worry to his face that was rarely seen. He could leave behind the Great Dong Mountain because Uncle Wu Zhu, whom he was most worried about, was in the absolute environment of the Great Dong Mountain. Compared to Yi Luyun, Sigujian, and even old Eunuch Hong, he had an absolute advantage. No one could keep him. However, Jingdo urgently needed him to return. They needed the jade seal in his pocket and the Emperor's personally written letter to the Empress Dowager. Outside Danzhou, were you on the ship? Fan Xian asked in a low voice as he stood behind Su Maokai, still wearing his bodyguard uniform. Yes. Receiving a definite answer, Fan Xian immediately asked, When did Yan Xiaoi get on the ship? I'm not sure, Su Maokai replied. It should have been on the way from Danzhou to Dong Mountain. Fan Xian furrowed his brows. It looked like the eldest princess's alliance had received mutual approval. There weren't many cracks within that could be used. In Danzhou, you should have seen a white sailboat. Su Maokai tilted his head in confusion and said, That was your ship. Of course, I noticed it. I want to get on that ship. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed slightly. His tone carried a sense of unquestionable certainty. Yan Xiaoi's eyes have probably already risen from the bottom of the sea. It will be too difficult for me to go ashore. Is there a way to head north on the sea? Su Maokai furrowed his brows and said, Then it would be better to take the ship directly to Danzhou. However, that will depend on luck. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then nodded. My luck has always been excellent. On the dark surface of the sea, the Navy ship closest to Dong Mountain shone with a bright light. It did its best to maintain contact with the ships around it. The ship was enormous. Compared to the Great Dong Mountain that stretched between heaven and earth, it was pitifully small. It was like a green bean in front of a piece of white paper. The soldiers on the ship stared nervously at the surface of the sea. It was as if they wanted to find clues in the water. Occasionally, someone would shout something. Many soldiers held bows and arrows in their hands, ready to shoot into the sea at any moment. A long time had passed since the figure on the stone wall disappeared into the wave. From the surface of the sea to the land on either side of Dong Mountain, countless people were searching for Fan Xian's traces. No one thought that Fan Xian would be hiding on the rebel soldiers' own ship. Yan Xiaoi, dressed in light archery gear, stood silently at the head of the ship. The soldiers at his side helped him carry the heavy golden bow. He picked up a cup of strong wine from the wooden table beside him and drained it in one gulp. He continued to stare coldly at the waves below the cliff. Although a long time had passed, He still believed that Fan Xian had not died. Although Fan Xian had been hit by his arrow and intimidated by the sword that broke the waves, Yan Xiaoyi still believed that Fan Xian had not died. He sent out an order for the navy and the soldiers on the shore to step up their search. Yan Xiaoyi knew that Fan Xian was injured, but he unconsciously hoped that Fan Xian was still alive. It would be best if he was still alive in front of him, and then have his arrow ruthlessly pierce into his throat. He loathed Fan Xian, this pretty boy. He hated him because he knew that his only son's death had something to do with Fan Xian. It was also because that night in the streets of Jingdou, he had held a hard bow in his hand. Yet, he had been at a complete disadvantage in his foggy confrontation with Fan Xian. This was a humiliation he could not accept. Fan Xian had to die by his hand to wash away this humiliation. This time, you probably won't be so lucky. A ruthless light flashed through Yan Xiaoyi's eyes. He stared motionlessly at the stone wall of Dong Mountain. He thought of the scene he had seen earlier, the scene that had shocked him. That pretty boy had been able to slip down from such a high, steep, and smooth precipice. If it were not for Yan Xiaoyi's profound realm and startling eyesight, the navy soldiers on the surface of the sea would not have found a trace of Fan Xian. Fan Xian would probably have used the water to escape thousands of li away. All of the rebel soldiers would have thought that the young commissioner was still trapped on the mountain. This was not a matter of luck. It was a matter of strength. Yan Xiaoyi's heart chilled slightly. He was shocked by the strength Fan Xian had demonstrated. Because the ship was too far from the precipice, his 13 consecutive arrows had not nailed Fan Xian to the precipice. They had only injured him. This reality made it difficult for Yan Xiaoyi to suppress his emotions. How could such a powerful enemy allow him to escape tonight's sure-kill situation? How is the search on each ship? Yan Xiaoyi asked with a cold face. When he did not find a trace of Fan Xian in the ocean, he immediately thought that the kid had climbed onto their ship from the ocean. The people the Jiaozhou Navy had sent this time were all people on their side who knew the inside story. Yan Xiaoyi did not suspect anything. The admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy, Qin Yi, glanced at him and said in a low voice, "He's not on the ship." He was a second-generation figure of the Qin family and the cousin of the Deputy Bureau of Military Affairs, Qin Heng. Because of Fan Xian's investigation of the Jiaozhou case last year, he had the opportunity to take over the position of admiral of the Jiaozhou Navy. Since he was standing shoulder to shoulder with Yan Xiaoyi at the bow of the ship, the Qin family's attitude was clear. Be careful. This person is very crafty. Since he came down from the mountain, he must have something important on him. If he is allowed to rush back to Jingdou, it will probably have a great impact on the eldest princess and old Qin master's plans, Yan Xiaoyi said quietly. Qin Yi acknowledged. Although he was a first-level admiral of the navy, in front of Yan Xiaoyi, this super-level admiral, he didn't have the slightest qualification to be unyielding. Particularly in this siege of Dong Mountain, all sides looked out for each other, but the one with the most power was still Yan Xiaoyi. Yan Xiaoyi looked at the ocean in front of him and suddenly furrowed his brows. "I'm worried that Fan Xian has come ashore from the bottom of the ocean." No one can hold their breath at the bottom of the ocean for so long, Qin Yi shook his head. Qin Yi shook his head and said, "There are your trusted soldiers on the shore, as well as the aces from Dongyi. They shouldn't give him a chance." A strange smile rose to the corners of Yan Xiaoyi's lips. He thought that for that pretty boy to be able to slide down a precipice hundreds of meters high, how could he be judged by common sense? Seeing Yan Xiaoyi's worry, Qin Yi calmly said, "Tomorrow, at the latest, the day after tomorrow, the plans in the provinces along the road will begin. Although we cannot use the name of the Overwatch Council, we have to send out the news that Fan Xian assassinated the emperor. He is the most serious criminal in the world. How can he escape?" Yan Xiaoyi glanced at him mockingly and didn't say anything. He thought, how could a normal general know the power of a ninth-level ace? If he was allowed to come ashore and enter the vast sea of people, even if the court was fooled by the eldest princess and gave Fan Xian the charge of rebellion, who could guarantee that Fan Xian would not be able to enter the capital? If Fan Xian escapes ashore, he will certainly find the closest Overwatch Council subordinate to send a message to Jingdo, Yan Xiaoi said coldly. Although there are Overwatch Council spies everywhere in the provinces, he is most at ease. The ones closest to him are, without question, the people he left in Danzhou. Qin Yi understood and said, I will immediately arrange for someone to go to Danzhou. If Fan Xian was on this ship and heard this conversation, he would certainly want to hug and kiss Yan Xiaoi. He had been on Su Maotsai's ship thinking hard about how to return to his own ship in Danzhou. Unexpectedly, Governor Yan had given him such a wonderful opportunity. However, why did he have to go to Danzhou? Yan Xiaoi finished arranging everything and slowly raised his head. The index and middle fingers of his right hand unconsciously curled up. This was a habitual movement brought about by his long years as a bow and arrow. Following the movement of his fingers, his gaze had already landed on the distant and dark summit of Dong Mountain. He knew where the Emperor was and what awaited the Emperor. Even though the rebellion had already progressed to this stage, as a soldier, he still felt 1 part admiration, 3 parts reverence, and 5 parts discomfort toward the Emperor. If his only son's death had not made it clear to him that his son was never as precious as the Emperor's son, perhaps Yan Xiaoi would have chosen some other method and not done what he did tonight. Fortunately, he did not need to interfere in the matters on the summit. Yan Xiaoi thought this. Handing over the soldiers in front of the mountain gate to that person was part of the agreement. His mood would also be a bit better. Then, he bowed respectfully toward the surface of the sea, wishing that the old man on the boat, who was about to ascend Dong Mountain, would send the Emperor off on his behalf. Chapter 530. Yesterday, I wrote that Yan Xiaoi was 1 part admiration, 3 parts respect, and 5 parts uneasiness toward the Emperor. A reader asked on Q, 1 plus 3 plus 5 is equal to 9. Old cat, what about the last part? At this moment, I looked around and called out to Big Mountain, what about the last part? What about the last part? Big Mountain's reply said to me, that is respect for the author's muddle-headedness. P.S. Everyone, give me some monthly vote. The milk-like white mist slowly spread across the surface of the sea. It was quiet all around. There was only the faint sound of water rippling not far away. The sound grew clearer and clearer. 3 battleships broke through the mist like ghosts and gradually revealed their black hulls. Su Maokai stood at the head of the ship and gave orders in a low voice to his subordinate officers. This group of 3 ships obeyed the order and followed the coastline north in pursuit. It didn't take long for them to reach their designated location. This place was about 12 li away from Danzhou. The Overwatch Council's ship with white sails was anchored on the dock south of Danzhou. With the cover of the thick mist, these 3 battleships could approach the Overwatch Council ship without anyone noticing. However, this also brought unknown trouble to their search. The Navy soldiers already knew that the black-clothed man who had escaped from Dong Mountain in the night was the target of this trip, the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, Fan Xian. They didn't know why their superiors had sent them to the south of Danzhou. They didn't know that Yan Xiaoi was certain that after Fan Xian escaped, he would make contact with his trusted aide on this white sailboat at the first instant. Fan Xian wore a slightly loose personal soldier's clothing that covered his black night clothes and equipment. He hid in the front cabin of the battleship and was not worried about being discovered by the people on the ship. His eyes peered out through the crack in the window lattice and narrowed slightly. He was worried about the ship on the other side of the mist. The 3 ships headed north on the sea, maintaining an excellent distance from the coastline. Su Maokai tried a few times to get the ship closer to the shore but was worried that his movements would be too big and raise the suspicions of the pursuers. Thus, Fan Xian was unable to go ashore during these 2 hours. Fan Xian had thought about escaping alone, but he was worried about the subordinates he had left in the south of Danzhou. The Qinian unit still had a small group left on the ship. Hong Chongqing, whom he liked very much, was still responsible for the affairs on that ship. At this moment, there were 3 naval battleships surrounding and attacking him. If he escaped, what would happen to the lives of his subordinates? He didn't know if Yan Xiaoyi was on one of the 3 ships. Anger and helplessness welled up in his heart. He had always thought that his luck was extremely good, but now he realized that luck was a double-edged sword. If he didn't show himself, the Overwatch Council ship would certainly become the Navy's primary target. No one on the ship would survive. If these 3 warships were all controlled by Su Maokai, Fan Xian would have a better way to deal with them. The problem was that Admiral Qin Yi did not make such a mistake. The 3 warships were transferred from the 3 generals. More importantly, Fan Xian didn't think Yan Xiaoyi would be so careless. If he thought he was going to find the Overwatch Council subordinates in the south of Danzhou after escaping, why wouldn't he follow him? He sat on a chair by the window and adjusted his breathing. He knew he was about to face a difficult choice. Yan Xiaoyi had moved troops to attack the south of Danzhou. This was using the lives of his subordinates to force him to show himself. Yan Xiaoyi had probably long guessed that he was hiding on a ship. However, he didn't know which ship he was on and couldn't search without giving the Jiaozhou Navy face. The problem was, Fan Xian also didn't know which ship Yan Xiaoyi was on. If only he knew. The white fog grew thicker, but the sea wind grew stronger. Gradually, it blew away the fog, which was as thick as a mountain cloud, to the sides. Through the window, one could faintly see the cliffs and green trees by the shore. Quietly anchored by the shore, the white sailboat as beautiful and lovely as a virgin, the sailboat that had accompanied Fan Xian for a long time, gradually entered everyone's sight. Fan Xian's heart tightened. The cliff and green trees on the shore were too tempting for him. If he abandoned that ship and directly went ashore, even if Yan Xiaoyi was on the ship right now and went ashore to pursue him, he was confident he had a 60% chance of escaping, mixing into the sea of people and reaching Jingdou. However, that ship was even more tempting for Fan Xian. The lives and deaths of his subordinates on that ship were also very important to Fan Xian. When all was said and done, he had lived 2 lives and still hadn't reached Chen Pingping's realm. He had to board that ship. He had to warn his subordinates, still deep in their dreams before the Navy rebel army launched their attack. The sound of ropes snapping gradually rang out on the 3 Navy battleships. Fan Xian's heart tightened again. He knew that the catapults on the ships were being prepared. It was clear that the people on the white sailboat in the distance had relaxed their guard, because they were deep in the heart of the Qin kingdom and had no major figures to protect. They did not sense the strange movement on the sea. Fan Xian's pupils constricted slightly. With a flick of his finger, he called Su Maokai back into the cabin. In a low voice, he prepared to gamble. The 3 battleships moved in a triangular formation and slowly surrounded the Overwatch Council's ship. When they were still some distance away, the ship Su Maokai was on suddenly seemed to be struck by a wave. There was a problem with the helmsman's control, and the angle of the bow of the ship was slightly off. The rebel army generals on the other 2 ships furrowed their brows slightly. They thought General Su had not been in battle for a long time and had made such a mistake. Seeing that he hadn't alerted the target on the shore, they didn't take it to heart. It was this momentary negligence. With a muffled thud, it seemed to be the sound of some heavy machinery being pulled. Immediately after, a shrill whistling sound broke through the air in the white fog. Several sharp stones flew out from the catapult on the battleship that Su Maokai was on. The enormous weight carried a terrifying speed as it flew across the sky above the water surface. It ignored the gentle mist enveloping it and smashed down without any warning toward the battleship of the Navy that was closest to the shore. A few loud bangs rang out. One of the rocks smashed into the side wall of the battleship and smashed right above the waterline, creating a large, black hole. A piece of stone smashed into the main mast of the battleship. With a crack, the thick main mast broke in the middle, revealing sharp and towering wooden stubble. The large sail fell down with a crash, smashing down who knew how many Navy officers. The nooses that were connected to the sail also became soul-sucking ropes in that instant. Driven by the mast, they swept across the ship, tearing through the air and passing those Navy officers who were standing stupidly, cutting their waists in half. It could only be said that this rock had good luck. In just an instant it caused a heavy death on the battleship. Countless amounts of blood, flesh, and red water sprayed out. These were 3 battleships prepared for a sneak attack. When they were ambushed from the inside by their own people, everything seemed very sudden. They had no time to defend. It was as if in this instant, the 3 battleships in the triangular formation all stopped at the same time. Time stopped. One could only hear the terrifying sound of huge rocks breaking through the air. Fire! Su Maotsai's face was ashen as he shouted in a low voice. Following his order, countless fire arrows rose into the air at the same time and shot toward the already heavily damaged battleship. The fire arrows landed like raindrops on the already heavily damaged battleship. It was unknown whether the officers on the ship were dead or alive. No one organized a counterattack, much less a rescue. In just an instant, the entire ship began to burn. In particular, the sails covering the ship became the largest source of fuel for the fire. Su Maotsai's expression was complicated. Everyone on that battleship was his colleagues. If it was not the most dangerous moment, he would not have chosen to use such a method to ambush. To be able to organize the attack of the entire ship in such a short amount of time, if he had not operated in the Jiaozhou Navy for 20 years, and if the soldiers on this ship were not all his trusted aides, he would not have dared to imagine such a good result. He furrowed his brows and gazed at the white sailboat on the shore. From the strange movements on the boat, he realized that the Overwatch Council should have already reacted. He had done what he promised the young master. He clenched his right fist slightly and gestured behind him. On the right side of the battleship that had suddenly launched a despicable sneak attack, the crossbow machine used for close combat on the sea suddenly moved. With a muffled sound, the entire battleship shook slightly. The crossbow bolt with an anchor quickly shot out and landed directly on the Overwatch Council battleship on the shore. The 2 ships were connected by the rope pulled by the huge crossbow arrow. The people of the Chinian unit of the Overwatch Council courageously sprinted to the side of the ship with the intention of cutting the rope. However, they heard the sound of an arrow of command coming from the sea fog. They couldn't help being startled. They then turned and ran, abandoning the ship with incredible speed. Following the gangway to the shore, they climbed ashore. Like countless shadows, they disappeared into the fog on the shore. Their movements were so fast that it left one dumbfounded. This was the reason the Overwatch Council was so powerful. The reaction of all of the officials and secret agents of the 8 bureaus to the sound of an arrow of command was already rooted in the depths of their hearts. They didn't need to ask why, they only needed to do as they were told. On the sea, a ship burned fiercely. Occasionally, wretched cries rang out. The ship that had launched the sneak attack stopped on the sea and was connected to the white sailboat on the shore. After the people on the white sailboat fled at a shocking speed, they left behind a dead ship. As for the last ship, speed up! A glimmer of fear flashed through Su Maotsai's eyes. Looking at the undamaged Navy battleship, it suddenly sped up. With extraordinary speed, it charged forward from the bottom left and directly entered the area of the sea in front of the Pin family. It lay between his ship and the shoreline. Furthermore, he could clearly see that the other ship was already preparing to launch an attack. Earlier, Su Maokai had already thrown out all the stones and fire arrows on the ship in exchange for such a result. Seeing that the other party was preparing to launch an attack, his first reaction was, "Return to the helm. Return." Before he could say the words, "Return to the oars," Su Maocai's mouth opened, but he couldn't say a single word. A gust of wind forced its way into his lips, making it difficult for him to make a sound. The wind of an arrow. A foot viciously kicked Su Maocai's hip bone. The powerful force sent him flying. He crashed into the side of the ship and sent up a few splinters of wood. It was because of this that he was lucky enough to avoid the wind of an arrow coming toward him. When Su Maocai's body had just been kicked to the side, the wind of the arrow brushed past his face and flew out. The wind of the arrow was as powerful as a pine tree piercing through a mountain. However, it did not make a loud sound and was completely sinister. There was a light whoosh. Su Maokai lay in the splinters of wood and looked at the scene in front of him in a daze. He was so terrified that his body began to tremble. There were a total of 5 Navy soldiers with delicate little holes on their bodies. They still maintained the expression of their last moments of life and death. They stood with their eyes and mouths agape. However, they were no longer breathing. Blood flowed out from their throats, chests, abdomens, and the delicate little holes on their heads. A delicate little black arrow was nailed into the wooden planks of the front of the battleship. The feathers of the arrow trembled at high speed and made a buzzing sound. Blood dyed the feathers of the arrow. With a drip, a drop of blood fell. A drop of blood. A floor full of dead people. What kind of arrow was this? Pulling back the foot that had kicked Su Maocai's body, Fan Xian knew he had lost the gamble. Yan Xiaoi was indeed on the ship, but he was not on the fire ship that Su Maokai was desperately attacking. He knew that his tracks had already fallen into Yan Xiaoi's eyes. It was useless to continue to hide. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the battleship that still maintained a fast speed and crashed toward the official ship on the shore. He looked at the bow of the ship at the head of the ship, wearing black light armor and holding a bow like a god. With a flip of his hand, he put on the light-colored side of the Overwatch Council's official robes. He turned his head and glanced at Su Maokai, whose face was half in a pool of blood and who had already lost an ear. His right foot, wearing a calf leather boot, had already stepped onto the rope connecting his ship to the white sailboat. His body swayed. The disguised Fan Xian slid along the rope in the fog. His body was slightly arched, and like a leopard, he silently slipped into the white mist. With a swish, an arrow did not shoot toward Fan Xian's body, which had disappeared into the fog. Instead, it shot toward the crossbow rope tied to the right side of the battleship. In an instant, the tip of the arrow tore the rope knot into pieces. The rope between the two ships drooped weakly into the sea. However, there was no sound of anyone falling into the water. Yan Xiaoi coldly pulled back his longbow and watched as the ship under his feet crashed toward the Overwatch Council official ship at an extraordinary speed. On the other end of the fog, Fan Xian was like a ghost. Holding the broken rope with one hand, he floated into his familiar cabin. He didn't have time to see if any of his subordinates were injured. He also didn't care that less than an arrow's throw behind him, the massive Navy battleship was heading toward his butt. He directly kicked one of the boxes in the cabin. With a loud and clear sound, the sturdy and hard wooden box was kicked by his foot, which contained an endless amount of Zhen Qi. Wood chips flew everywhere, and silver light shot out in all directions. Silver light shot out in all directions. 130,000 taels of silver poured out of the cracked chest like a ripe pomegranate whose belly had been cut open. Chapter 531. Fan Xian stretched out his arm and caught the black chest in the silver ingots scattered all over the floor. A slightly rough but textured feeling came from his fingers. This kind of familiar and wonderful feeling seemed to, in an instant, pour boundless courage and gentry into his body. It made him throw away all of his timidity and fear. He was filled with confidence, and did not think much of the ship that was about to crash into him behind him. He threw himself into the cabin. This series of actions was too fast, so he didn't notice there was someone beside him. Thus, when his ambition was multiplied and he carried the black chest, prepared to break out of the cabin, enter the land, and dominate the world, he abruptly discovered that there was an extra person wearing the robes of the Overwatch Council beside him. He couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. He was only stunned for a moment because this person was Hong Chongqing, a trusted aide of the Chinian unit he had given the important task of. There was no time to talk. Fan Xian only glanced at him. The meaning of this glance was clear. "I've sent out an arrow of command. Why aren't you running?" Hong Chongqing stared back at him in a daze. The meaning in his eyes was also clear. How could he bear to throw away 130,000 liang of silver and run? "He had to watch for you a bit longer, right?" Was the so-called mutual appreciation of talent a meeting of eyes like this? Their gazes met for a moment before separating. Hong Chongqing moved with incredible speed to stand behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian's left hand, which was as hard to escape as an azure dragon, also viciously grabbed the back of Hong Chongqing's neck. Bang! An arrow accurately shot into Hong Chongqing's abdomen. Countless flowers of blood bloomed. Hong Chongqing's face suddenly paled. Although his previous step had been to bravely block the arrow for Fan Xian, he had never thought that this arrow would so easily break through the wind of his knife and strike his body. The power of the arrow did not stop. It viciously pierced into the silver ingots scattered on the deck of the ship. Coincidentally, it pierced into the silver ingots. It looked like a metal skewer piercing a steamed bun. It was very cute and terrifying. Fan Xian's face was heavy. With one hand holding the chest and the other grabbing the back of Hong Chongqing's neck, he sprinted toward the back of the ship. Behind him, the arrows fell like rain, following his footsteps and chasing after his soul. However, they did not make his steps chaotic or slow down. "Let's find the Black Knights and meet up again." Fan Xian placed one foot on the railing at the end of the boat and slapped his palm against Hong Chongqing's chest, who was powerless to speak. He sent in a thread of Tianyi Dao's gentle zhenqi and temporarily helped him seal his blood vessels. His body was like a large bird. Borrowing the power of this slap, he leaped into the air. Lightly and powerlessly, he flew quickly. In the next moment, he had already landed on the shore. He didn't even turn around to look at Hong Chongqing, who had miserably fallen into the sea. Although he didn't know what degree of injury that arrow had inflicted on Qinghua, he firmly believed that Qinghua wouldn't die. Since he could survive that hellish island, he would definitely survive this time as well. Perhaps this was a kind of psychological self-comfort, or perhaps it was a kind of blessing. Perhaps Fan Xian truly believed in Qinghua's ability to play dead. On the sea, Su Maokai held the side of his face that was bleeding and said sinisterly, "Reverse the oars." The Navy battleship under him began to nimbly turn its rudder, distancing itself from the fighting on the shoreline. The surface of the sea was covered in thick smoke. Mixing with the white fog, it made people's vision even worse. Su Maokai knew that he had to take advantage of this opportunity to leave this troublesome place. According to the young master's plan, he had to start drifting on the sea and, if necessary, rush back to Jiaozhou. The ship quickly retreated in the sea. Su Maokai stared at the white sailboat by the shoreline. His pupils constricted slightly. At this moment, he could no longer help Fan Xian. He was very worried about whether or not Fan Xian could escape alive. A massive crash rang out. The only undamaged ship of the 3 Navy battleships was like a killer whale charging onto the shore to catch a sea lion. Viciously and unstoppably, it crashed into the Overwatch Council's white sailboat. Affected by the powerful force of the collision, the seawater by the shoreline seemed to boil and raise waves half a person tall. With the shoreline as the center, they spread out in all directions. With a series of cracking sounds, the Overwatch Council's ship seemed to be about to fall apart from this collision. In the instant of the collision, 6 or 7 figures used the force of the collision to rise from the Navy battleship into the air. They maintained a perfect formation in the air. With a few swishing sounds, they landed on the tail of the violently shaking Overwatch Council ship. The most breathtaking one was the one among the 6 or 7 people, Yen Xiaoi, who was dressed in thin black armor. He was like a god as he soared through the air and landed steadily on the deck at the stern of the ship like a boulder. After landing, he did not move at all. Beside him were 5 aces of the North Expedition Camp's personal guards. Yen Xiaoi arrived quickly, but Fan Xian and the Qinian unit's subordinates ran even faster. Other than the silver ingots and wood shavings all over the ground, there was no one else on the ship. Yen Xiaoi stood at the tail of the ship and stared coldly at the shore. He stared at the quickly disappearing black dot. Pulling back his wrist, his right arm shook. At some point, the soul-eating longbow with golden threads had appeared in his hand. Loading the arrow and controlling the bowstring, the series of actions flowed in one breath like flowing water. The distance between the tail of the ship and Fan Xian's body on the shore was not too far nor too close. It was the distance at which the longbow could unleash its greatest destructive power. The black arrow left the bowstring with power like wind and thunder. This arrow had already condensed the peak of Yen Xiaoi's spirit and power. It seemed to have faintly broken through the so-called limits of speed and passed through the membrane of space. It was invincible. One moment it was on the bowstring, the next moment it was already behind Fan Xian. Fan Xian did not have time to turn his head, nor could he turn his head. Even though he had become the fastest dodging person in the world under Wu Zhu's training, after experiencing a night of fighting and running, faced with Yen Xiaoi's fastest and most powerful arrow since last night, he still had no way of dodging it. As expected, the tip of the arrow pierced viciously into Fan Xian's back. No, it should have hit the black chest on Fan Xian's back. A muffled grunt came from the fog on the shore. The black dot seemed to stagger and almost fell to the ground from the arrow. For some reason, it immediately pushed off the ground and ran quickly into the distance. Not dead? Not dead? Covered by the thick fog, the people on the ship could only faintly see Fan Xian's figure. Even someone as powerful as Yen Xiaoi did not clearly see the details of the arrow hitting the other person. A glimmer of fear and confusion appeared on the faces of Yen Xiaoi's 5 trusted soldiers. After a night of chasing Fan Xian to this point, everyone's confidence gradually faded. There was actually someone in this world who could slip down a smooth precipice hundreds of feet high. There was actually someone in this world who could be hit by the governor's arrow with all his strength and only stagger. These trusted soldiers suddenly thought of the background of the person they were chasing. They thought of the legendary Tianmai being and many stories related to Fan Xian. It was inevitable that some emotions would surge in Yen Xiaoi's heart. However, his cold face made it impossible to see the changes in his heart. He slapped the railing of the ship and floated to the shore. The faint sound of horses galloping came from the forest by the shore. The 5 trusted soldiers at the stern of the ship met each other's eyes and swept ashore with unswerving determination. In a moment, a group of riders galloped out of the forest and gave up their mounts to Yen Xiaoi's group of 6. Yen Xiaoi's preparations could not be said to be inadequate. This trip to Danzhou to lure and kill was carried out by land and water. With fine horses below, how could Fan Xian escape? The sound of horse hooves rang out. The group chasing Fan Xian disappeared into the fog on the shore. After the white-sailed official ship was hit, it began to slowly sink into the icy ocean. Bodies and debris floated everywhere on the surface of the ocean. Hong Chongqing jumped down. Fan Xian jumped down. Yan Xiaoi and his trusted soldiers also jumped down. The 130,000 liang of silver also sank. The chase continued. A day later, in the primitive and dense forest to the north of Danzhou, behind a large tree, Fan Xian, dressed all in black, was sitting on the moss. He panted heavily and occasionally stretched out his hand to wipe away the blood seeping out of the corner of his mouth. Then, he gently stroked the small dot on the surface of the chest in his arms. A chill rose in his heart. From his youth, he had known the sturdiness of this chest. Even the black dagger Sir Fei had given him could not leave a mark on it. Who would have thought that Yan Xiaoi's arrow had left a mark on the chest? From this, it could be seen how powerful Yan Xiaoi's arrow was. Presumably, those people had not expected him to directly block that arrow. A glimmer of a smile rose to the corners of Fan Xian's lips. With such a chest on him, if he didn't use it as a bulletproof vest, then he would be stupid. However, he knew that although the chest had blocked the tip of the arrow from piercing into his body, it had no way of blocking the sharp intent of the arrow and the powerful vibrations that were transmitted to him. Thus, his internal organs were injured on top of injuries, and his zhenqi was beginning to show signs of disorder. That was why he was trapped in the dense forest to the north of Danzhou by Yan Xiaoi's pursuit group in an area with a radius of less than 10 li. However, Fan Xian was not worried. On the contrary, a faint excitement began to rise in the depths of his heart. He forcefully suppressed his slightly panting breathing. With a gentle pull of the fingers on both hands, he opened the long and narrow black chest. Inside the chest were simple, unadorned, and even simple-looking metal objects. Fan Xian knew that this was far from being as tyrannical and beautiful as the golden silk longbow in Yan Xiaoi's hand. It was the most terrifying weapon in this world. He closed his eyes and rested for a moment. Then, his hands began to quickly move about in the chest. Following a series of simple and beautiful clicking sounds, a weapon that did not belong to this world calmly appeared in his hands. The last time this weapon appeared in this world, it directly led to the strange deaths of 2 Qing princes, created King Cheng's ascension to the throne, and gave the present emperor the opportunity to sit on the throne. From a certain point of view, the destruction of the Wei kingdom, the change in the situation of the world, and the power of the Qing kingdom all stemmed from the assault rifle in Fan Xian's hands. M82A1, a simple code name, a black chest, a legendary divine weapon. Using the large tree as cover, he carefully climbed up the mountain. Thinking of the people who had died this night, Fan Xian licked his dry lips as he crawled. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.